One clear day, an army of cavalry decided to attack a peaceful family whose head was a dark-haired guy. Noticing them approaching, the lad said he would take care of the young lady, and the white-haired girl wished him luck, calling him her father. The blonde-haired woman ordered the guy to smash them, and the young boy used his earth compression power. A blonde-haired man on a black horse noticed this and stopped. The young swordsman caught him by surprise as he found himself in front of his horse with the speed of the wind. Gritting his teeth, the blonde-haired boy swung his spear at the swordsman and ordered him to die, but the young man used his sword kai power. He used the light step technique and defeated his enemy with ease. The blonde-haired guy just fainted and the swordsman gently placed him on the horse. This whole story began with one dark-haired young man in Japan. The end of the next week was looming and the year would be over. While the hero was crossing the road at a crosswalk, he stared at his phone and thought it was a real bore. But all of a sudden he saw a strange message on his phone as well, asking the guy if he wanted to go to another world. The protagonist didn't even notice when the red light came on and he was yelled at that he was in danger. Before the guy knew it, a big truck was on the road in front of him. The hero was on the ground and all he heard was that a high school student had been hit by the truck. People called an ambulance and noticed that his bones were broken. The guy didn't understand why he couldn't feel his body and only thought he was going to die. As soon as he closed his eyes, he woke up near some old man with a staff. The hero tried to realize where he was and noticed that he was on a cloud from where the city was clearly visible. The old man pointed the staff at the guy and said that he was too noisy and if he moved around a lot he would fall off. The guy panicked and asked him not to hit him with that stick. The old man noticed that the youth was being rather rude and warned the lad that he was talking to a god. The hero had a rather strange look on his face, as if he wasn't surprised by his words. As it turned out, he had previously been warned by his grandmother that he should never believe someone who said he was a god. The old man inquired about his grandmother's life and recalled that there was a similar woman here. As soon as the old man told her he was a god, she called him a profanity. At some point, the hero decided that this old man was indeed a god, because the grandmother said that she would probably argue nonsense if she found herself in front of God. The boy assumed that they had met him by mistake. The old man sat down at his desk and decided to get back to the main point. He admitted that it was his mistake. The hero didn't understand what he was talking about and the old man asked the guy his name. The hero introduced himself by the name Sansui. The thing was that his name was similar to the teenager's name and he made the mistake of extinguishing the candle of his life. Sansui decided that it was probably time for him to retire. The god smiled and said that he was here forever, and Sansui noticed that the old man must be happy about that. Because of his mistake, the god wanted to send the guy to another world. It was a completely different world, which the hero was delighted with and exclaimed that it was a great development of the end of his life. In that case, the old man decided to give him powers so he would not die. He could choose any of the ones offered. He should have just said. Sansui exclaimed with burning eyes that he wanted to be the strongest man on earth. God paused and asked him if he was not ashamed to say such a thing. But it was the plain truth, for the lad had dreamed of this since childhood, and the god had to agree. The old man wrote a letter and asked him to take it with him. He handed the envelope to the hero and warned that one day he would meet someone to whom he had to give this letter. Also, this person would have to teach him, but Sansui understood absolutely nothing. The old man said that while he would become the strongest, he would guide him, and the hero had to work hard to become strong. Lastly, he asked him to remember to give this letter and said that it was time for Sansui to go. The hero asked the old man to stop, but it was too late, and a hole formed under his feet. Sansui flew down screaming and the god waved goodbye to the guy. The hero found himself in some incomprehensible forest. Besides, the old man did not even give him any instructions. The only thing he said was to remember to give the letter to the unknown person. Sansui thought he noticed movement in front and stopped. He decided to shout, hoping that someone would hear him. He did not even notice that a young man was standing in one of the trees closest to him, silently watching him. The mysterious stranger gave himself away and Sansui felt a certain uneasiness. Yet, despite this, he was happy to meet someone from another world here. The first thing that seemed strange to the hero was that the man was standing on a rather tiny twig and the stranger decided to jump to the ground. The stranger stared at the young man in surprise and decided that he seemed non-threatening. He assumed that Sansui was looking for a village and warned that it was 7 days' walk away. For whatever reason, the hero immediately thought that this stranger was his teacher. The young boy looked questioningly at Sansui, not knowing what he was talking about. Sansui was finally confused and didn't realize who he was supposed to deliver the letter to in that case. He decided to do as the old man told him and just gave the stranger the letter. Judging from the envelope, it was a presentation letter which interested the young man. As soon as he read it, the guy's surprised face changed to a frown. He decided that the hero was completely crazy since he had decided to become the strongest in the world. And apparently, the god wanted him to shake the crap out of Sunsui. Sunsui hung his head grimly and felt ashamed. The stranger asked the guy if he knew what a Kensei was, but apparently he was unfamiliar with it. Then the guy agreed and said he would make him his student. Sunsui thanked the young man for his help, and the stranger said he would study the style used by the hermits. He smirked evilly and warned that their training would be difficult, so the lad should be prepared. The look he gave him made the hero feel uneasy. For some reason, the stranger felt like the kid didn't have certain talents, but he could probably become the strongest man on earth in 500 years. Sunsui was shocked when he heard that it would take him 500 years. He shouted that he would be long dead by then and wished he knew another way he could become stronger. But the guy smirked and told Sunsui that there was no quick way to get stronger, but he didn't have to worry about his life as long as he studied with him. The stranger said that his 500 years would fly by, and tears welled up in Sunsui's eyes. He only wanted a girl and authority only, that's all. The stranger smiled and said that he had been studying for 1,000 years and still hadn't finished his studies. Learning simply had no end, and Sunsui fell to his knees. It was hard for him to believe something like this. The stranger was able to move swiftly forward through the branches of the trees, but the Sunsui had to catch up with him on the ground. While the stranger was looking at the stick he had picked up, he heard a noise outside the house. It turned out to be the hero, who could hardly catch up with him. Trying to catch his breath, Sunsui didn't understand how he could jump on the ends of branches. The guy replied that he did it by using a technique that made his body lighter. He smiled and told the hero that it wouldn't be long before he would also be able to use this technique. But for whatever reason, it seemed to Sunsui that it definitely wouldn't be soon. The teacher handed the guy a stick he had found recently and asked him to take it. The hero assumed it was something along the lines of a wooden sword. The teacher said that his training would be simple, and every day at sunrise he would take this sword and start swinging it. He would have to swing it until the sun went down. Moreover, there would be no end to his swinging until the teacher instructed him. The guy smiled and motioned for them to begin, saying that only one quality would be important to the Sunsui, and that was his determination to keep practicing. The teacher asked the student to keep that in mind, and that was how he would one day become the strongest. From then on, the protagonist's 500 years long training began. He soon realized how difficult life was in this new world and began daily training with his master named Suiboku. The first years of training were harsh, and he would begin his sword strokes as the sun rose. This would last into the night, then he would go to bed to meet the dawn and begin training again. At first the hero was often hungry, but after a while the feeling of hunger began to settle down. As for the master, it seems sages like him only had enough of the power to continue living. They had no need for worldly food. With thoughts that he had no other choice, the hero continued his training, day after day, learning all the new things the master had taught him. He didn't even notice how his old school uniform became the master's kinagashi. It seemed to Sunsui that many years had flown by in an instant. And even after all those 500 years had passed, some things hadn't changed. The gap between the protagonist and the master hadn't narrowed at all. And while he was realizing his lack of training, an intruder sneaked into the forest. Sunsui and the master hurried into the forest, and Suiboku thought that this was the first time someone had entered this forest since his arrival. The hero sensed 2 weak intruders and wolves, and the master said they should hurry. Apparently the heroes were too late, for when they arrived they saw a man being devoured by a pack of wolves. Sunsui and his master descended to the ground, thus scaring the pack away. Perhaps it was fate, but the hero noticed that there was a surviving child here. Suiboku thought it was the opposite of a problem, but suggested the kid take this child and raise it. There was no immortal Kai power emanating from this child. The master could sense the magic emanating from the child, so becoming a sage didn't seem possible for him. But it wasn't necessary. The hero could raise him in the human world, and Sunsui agreed with Suiboku's words. The master told his apprentice that he would go to the human world and gain experience there, both as a sage and as a swordsman. One could consider this as part of his training. He was sure that the 500 years of training here and the techniques that Suiboku had taught Sunsui had made him stronger. The hero had to raise the child as his own, and Sunsui understood that perfectly. In that case, the master left everything to his apprentice and confessed that he was proud of him. Afterward, they buried the dead man and erected a monument to him in the form of a pyramid of pebbles. A small child reached out his hands to the hero, and the Sunsui smiled at him. Sunboku reminded him that he had been entrusted with the life of a man, and until he found an acceptable home and raised the child properly, he would not be allowed to go back. The master also smiled and asked the hero not to worry, for it would only be a moment for them. The hero agreed and promised to take care of his future and definitely not tarnish the master's name. In that case, Sunsui said goodbye to the master and left. The hero stopped at one of the branches and told the child that this was the beginning of their life together. And come to think of it, he was surprised at how much power he had gotten here. He wondered what the human world could give him, but first he had to get a job so the child would have something to eat. While the Sunsui seemed to be fluttering above the ground, the child was screaming and crying for some reason. But the hero didn't understand what was wrong. He assumed that the baby was already hungry, and the Sunsui thought that it would be quite a problem. He didn't have any breast milk for this infant, but he noticed a village nearby. The hero decided to head to the village that was nearby. Sunsui came to the village and said that this tiny spirit hopefully belonged to the infant, and the mother had to feed them both. He told one of the villagers that his wife had died, and as the woman could see, he had absolutely nothing on him. Sunsui didn't even have food to feed this infant, and he wasn't quite sure what to do. So if the woman was okay with it, the hero wished that she could feed this baby. The woman didn't mind, so she agreed to help Sunsui. The boy thanked the woman for her help and said that she didn't know how much she had helped him. The woman said hello to the baby and took him in her arms. She remarked that it was a pretty good little girl. As soon as the infant started drinking milk, she immediately calmed down. The woman wanted to warn the hero that there were no paying jobs in this area, plus he looked pretty young. Perhaps if he had better luck, he could go to the capital. She pointed out a road and said that the hero could follow it and reach the capital in a few days. The woman handed the child to the boy and asked him to hold her. She assumed that the girl had had enough and asked him to wait for her here. The protagonist had spent 500 years in this world, but he had never yet gone outside the forest area and was apparently now in a village in the kingdom. Sunsui realized that he knew absolutely nothing about the society of this world, but still, he had to raise this child no matter what. The little girl in his arms cried out, and the boy smiled sweetly at her. The woman went back inside and apologized for keeping him waiting. She brought the hero some goat's milk, but it should be enough to get him to the capital. Sunsui could not believe that he could really take it, but the woman replied that it would spoil even if he did not take it. The hero thanked the woman for her help and said he would never forget her kindness. The woman clapped the guy on the back with a smile, calling him a rascal, and suggested that he move on. The hero smiled at her goodbye and said that in that case he would continue on his way. The woman was shocked when the Sunsui promptly ran forward at the speed of the wind. The hero felt that someday he would have to repay her this debt while she was still alive. Along the way, the protagonist encountered a wagon, but he easily pushed off its roof and continued on his way. The girl who sat in the carriage saw only his shadow. The people who were nearby also noticed some movement and thought it was a bird. But one of the old men thought it must be a wind mage, and it was very fast. Compared to normal running, if a Sunsui used a light step to jump, it could move much faster. The hero felt a kind of bloodlust behind him and the guy turned back. A certain young man jumped out of the wagon and ordered him to stop. Sunsui assumed the guy had wind magic, and this was his first time seeing such a marvelous ability. The guy ordered the insolent peasant to shut up and said that he didn't even know whose carriage he stepped on, and if he didn't check or even recognize the coat of arms, that in itself was a crime. Sunsui speculated that he must have accidentally landed on the Veep carriage while jumping around. The young man pointed his sword at the hero and said that he would have lost an arm from that, but he seemed to care about the child, so he could show some sympathy for his circumstances, and if the hero appealed directly to his mistress, he could receive favor. Sunsui sighed heavily and asked to be allowed to apologize. The boy asked to follow him, and they approached the stopped carriage. The girl who was sitting by the window decided to verify with the Brower that this was the man from earlier. The guy confirmed that it was and asked the hero to apologize. The hero smiled and admitted that he was really sorry, plus he was from a rural area. He unknowingly must have stepped on their carriage earlier. Not to mention that he was from the countryside. Not even knowing any manners was a sign of savagery. The girl said he was no better than a dirty monkey, and he was wearing some rags. She assumed that the guy now understood the situation and next time asked to be respectful of their family crest. In light of the fact that he fathered a child, she would accept the apology for the moment, and the hero grinned awkwardly. The girl turned her attention to the child and decided to get out of the carriage. She would like to know the hero's name. The boy smiled in a friendly manner and introduced himself as a Shirokura Sansui. The guy said his name in syllables, but the girl said thoughtfully that she had never heard such a name. Apparently, his living situation was quite unstable now. The girl suggested that he come to her mansion, and if he passed her test, she would be willing to offer him a job. She smirked and thought that sounded pretty acceptable. The character was shocked, not realizing if it was really acceptable. Her attendant was also surprised and asked the lady to wait for a while. Sunsui's eyes lit up with happiness and he thought she was a rather nice person. The girl smiled and introduced herself by the name of Dewey. She assumed that she would soon be his mistress, so she asked to make sure he remembered her name. The lady's assistant exclaimed that for someone of her position to mess with this is very low. The girl looked at the brower in surprise. Dewey had already decided everything for herself and asked Sunsui to show her his palm. The hero was surprised at such a request, but still extended his hand to the girl. His hand looked like it had been used to holding a sword for a long time. Although in appearance, he looked to be her age. The guy thought that he might be one of the oldest people on the planet, but kept silent about it. Speaking of age, she probably wouldn't believe him if Sunsui told his real age. Sunsui clutched onto the child and decided he wouldn't tell her, because that's what any adult would probably do. Dewey assumed that Brower had already noticed that. She called the kid a primate and noticed that not a speck of magic came from him. In that case, the Brower didn't understand how he could gallop around like that. In other words, he possessed a rare type of magic. The protagonist didn't understand what they were talking about now, but he decided it was better for him to keep quiet. The master had once told him that magic was everywhere in the other world, but that didn't mean that everyone could use it. 99% of the entire population could use magical abilities. The remaining 1% couldn't use magic at all. This was all because these inhabitants didn't have the strength to activate magic abilities. Be that as it may, they could still reproduce the same effects of magic using methods that were not easy, more difficult to execute. Take their special rituals and ceremonies as an example. Sunsui thought his sage skills fell into the same category. Rare magic is a term that generalizes human abilities other than magic. Still, Dewey figured he could work it if he could actually use it. The guy crouched down on his knees and said he'd had enough of her giving him the opportunity. Arriving in the capital of the kingdom, the hero noticed that the vacation bars here were quite huge. To the loud stomping of hooves, the delighted hero arrived at the capital along with a Dewey carriage. He thought this capital was marvelous and surely his child thought the same. Brower was impressed that this savage seemed fascinated more by the bars than by Mrs. Dewey. The girl smiled and reassured Brower, saying it was all right. It was just that the guy was a peasant who was seeing the walls of the fortress for the first time and what was behind them. Surely it must have worried his heart. In any case, it had been a long time since they'd been to the capital and Dewey hoped her brother and father were all right. They had sent word of their arrival and Brower was sure they couldn't wait to see them. The boy was sure that trouble could be expected from them too. Meanwhile, Sunsui thought about how this world of the Middle Ages was full of fantasy. After spending 500 years in another world, he felt like he had finally made it to the real deal. The carriage along with the characters finally arrived at the Dewey mansion, and the horses stopped at the entrance of the mansion. The butler bowed, opened the carriage doors and greeted my lady. He was puzzled by a man unknown to him with a child in his arms. Dewey explained that she had picked up this primate recently and asked him to escort him and the child to their room. Sunsui smiled awkwardly. She called him a primate, but she was still a good person if you turned a blind eye. At some point, the baby cried loudly and the kid was confused, not knowing what to do. One of the maids asked to take the baby in her arms and tried to calm it down. The boy assumed that she had wet herself and thanked the girl for her help. Meanwhile, Dewey's father and brother welcomed the girl home and congratulated her on her return. Dewey smiled and told her father and older brother that it had been quite a while. Sunsui was delighted and thought it was cool. He could tell at a glance that they were worthy nobles. These two weren't just tall, they were also very well built, definitely soldiers with experience. The girl grinned and told her kin that she picked up a wild monkey on the road. He looked like he possessed rare magic, so she thought of making him her bodyguard. The older brother and father slowly approached the boy. The hero involuntarily felt an aura of rage from them. Everyone around them imperceptibly began to disperse, and the guy thought that it wasn't too late to run away. Dewey's older brother thought that the hero was probably plotting to lose his life since he had made a move toward his sister. Her father also couldn't believe that a midget like him wanted to protect his daughter, and asked him to give him a second. They pounced on him with their sabers and shouted at the Sunsui. The confused guy asked to wait literally a second, but apparently they didn't listen to him. Sunsui sadly exhaled and thought that he would have to do this. He took his stick and instantly hit the two attackers in the head with it. The hero felt embarrassed and apologized for this or to forgive his insolence. Sunsui swung without even thinking about the consequences and hoped they were okay. Dewey's older brother and her father stared at the guy in surprise. Dewey smiled, pleased that this was even beyond her expectations and apparently she had picked up a very impressive man. With his screams, the father further frightened the child in the maid's arms. He didn't understand what a sansui was and who he was. Anyway, it seemed to him to be quite an interesting story. He told his darling daughter that he would love to hear her explanation of the fact that this sansui would be living in their mansion. Dewey smiled and happily agreed with her father. The father took a stern look at the boy and told him that he was only staying because he had a child with him. As a result, after some time, Sansui ended up in a duel with Dewey's older brother. As the father explained earlier, this one targeting his daughter would attack suddenly, carrying a full armament. While fighting, he had to keep in mind that his armament was unreliable. The protagonist didn't realize how things eventually came to this. Dewey's father realized how things were and was not going to cancel his daughter's promise to him. Plus, he didn't think the guy could have turned out to be a spy since he was very conspicuous. And the fact that he was using rare magic was quite interesting to him. But on the other hand, if he wanted a place in this house, they would have a problem if he didn't know how to fight. Saying that, a smirk appeared on the old man's face. The guy thought that he would try to fight at his best during this test. But the hero suggested that these people might have made up the exam as a cover to kill him. At some point, they were interrupted by a maid and asked Sansui what his daughter's name was. The hero only now remembered that he hadn't given her a name yet, so he decided to call her by the name of Rain. The maid affectionately told Rain that this was the last time they would see him, so she could say goodbye to her daddy properly. Sansui gloomily looked at the maid and thought that even she was aware of everything. Dewey's father told her older brother that the hero would die from a single blow and asked him to make sure his death would be painful. The guy in armor smiled and agreed, because any man looking at his sister couldn't even repent of his sins. Sansui no longer doubted that he was a super protective father and brother with a huge sister complex. The brother said that if he didn't have any objections, they would start a duel. Lastly, Father Dewey told the hero that if he could destroy all his defenses with his wooden sword with one blow, he would let him and his child stay here. The father ordered his son to kill this stranger, and Dewey's older brother lunged at the lad with fury. He shouted that death awaited anyone who came near his favorite little sister and used the power of his blazing soul. Meanwhile, Sansui prepared for the attack and kept only calm. Before striking, he raised his stick upwards and used his soul-balanced sword skill. His powerful strike hit right on the opponent's helmet. Everyone froze in place in surprise as Dewey's older brother fell to the ground. The hero clarified with her father that he should have done it in one blow. While everyone was watching the guy in shock, Dewey became sad that Sansui is pretty boring fighting. Dewey's father still couldn't understand how his fully armed son could lose with one. Besides, he'd been defeated with a wooden sword and Dewey thought it was pretty boring. Brower thought it looked like the sword was all part of him. The father was horrified to think that if this continued, he would have to recognize this guy as his daughter's bodyguard. And he couldn't let that happen. He had sprung the moment when the hero was able to open up and wanted to strike him with his rapier. But Sansui said it was too slow and stabbed Dewey's father in the stomach. Dewey was amused by this, and she confessed to her father that she couldn't look at them without sighing. She wondered what had happened to them. A smile appeared on her face and she said that if there were no more objections, she would hire Sansui as her bodyguard. Brower looked surprised at the guy who looked perfectly normal in his opinion. The hero meanwhile smiled and thanked Dewey. Sansui noticed a maid approaching him with a baby in her arms. She smiled and told Rai-chan that her father was alive, to which the child was apparently very happy. The girl held out her arms to her father, and the hero took her in his arms. He thought he had now found a good place for her in which Rain would grow up. Looking at the whole situation from the outside, and at Dewey's disgruntled father, the hero hoped he had made the right choice. And yet Sansui proved to be able to find a place to work. Be that as it may, he had a bad feeling. After all, surely this Lady Dewey was an unusual noblewoman. Besides, when he told her that hermits don't burn, she was quite surprised by it, and ended up imprisoning Sansui in the flames. Then, when he told her that hermits don't drown, her facial expression was the same. And naturally, she almost tried to drown him. She was clearly a selfish woman who didn't like it when someone didn't follow her lead. And that's all because in her situation she could get away with it. In the Kingdom of Arcana, there were 4 noble families behind the royal family, and each with an assigned territory where they ruled. Dewey was a mistress of the Spade family. To her could still be added the father of their family, the head of the family paired super guarded by her brother. Her narcissistic antics could not be stopped by anyone. The reason Sansui stayed here was Rain. The great Spade family took care of their daughter, ignorant people like him. The maid that watched over the girl raised her like a proper lady. While reading the book, the child noticed Sansui and waved to him. The hero waved at the Rain with a smile and thought that he was only good for waving a sword. Therefore, he could not ask for a better place to raise her. Besides, Mrs. Dewey became very fond of Rain. Brow, who at first doubted in him, turned out to be a girl, and as appearances showed, she had matured a great deal. She turned out to be a very good sword mage and always put her best foot forward. Brow was always stern in her work, but also friendly and kind. There was an occasion when Mrs. Dewey's brother returned with Arcadia's army to take his honor back and called Sunsui back into battle. But it is better not to tell what happened after that. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, a whole 5 years flew by from the arrival of Sunsui and Rain at the mansion. One day, Sunsui met a horse-drawn wagon outside the mansion and helped the man out. While he was unloading his luggage, Rain ran out of the house and happily greeted her father. Brow told Sunsui that they had kept him waiting and asked if he was all set, to which she received an affirmative answer. Dewey came out of the mansion and exclaimed that she was tired of living with her parents, so it was finally time to go to the Royal Academy. Looking at the passing scenery, the Dewey asked Brow how much longer they had to drive to the academy. The girl replied that they would spend the night somewhere nearby, so they would go there tomorrow afternoon. But Dewey worried that there might be hooligans in the area. Sunsui thought that there was a den of bandits in the mountain close by, and Dewey's eyes lit up. She found it quite interesting. They had an ambush threat, so Brow would ask them to stay in the carriage, but Dewey didn't see any reason why she should listen to her. Besides, she had left her father's house because she was bored there every day, and now the brouhaha was telling her to get her ass tight. There was no way the girl wanted to sit still, it was so much more comfortable this way. Rain was worried that something might have happened to them and asked my lady about it. Dewey smiled and reassured her that there was nothing to worry about as her father and brouhaha were very strong. The hero glanced gloomily at the girl from whom he heard unexpected demands again. Even if she didn't complain, Rain looked worried. Sunsui had no doubt that he and Brow shouldn't have been a problem, but getting along with the ambush would be problematic for them. Even Brows frowned at Dewey's words, but they still couldn't cross the lady. In the end, they rode for a very long time to sneak deep into the mountain. Looking out the window, Rain was getting very scared and she pressed herself against Sunsui. The hero smiled as he understood her fear and didn't blame her for it. Sunsui sensed that the enemies were already here and turned to Brow. The girl asked their number and the guy replied that there were about 20 of them. Dewey hugged Rain and said that she would stay here with her. Brow told the guy that he would stay here and protect them while she dealt with the bandits. Guy asked the footman to stop the wagon. They were going out for a while, so Sunsui would like them to stay inside and close the door behind them. With his request, the wagon stopped at once. As soon as the Brow along with the hero got out of the wagon, armed bandits started coming out of the darkness of the forest from all sides. These bandits looked like fallen mercenaries. One of them kept thinking about who had been sent to them. The man thought they were just losers and could have been a good catch for them. Sunsui noticed that their equipment was badly worn and they looked very hungry. Brow exclaimed that this was sheer chutzpah and didn't understand how they dared to go up against a spade. The bandits clearly didn't care and pounced on the boys. The girl raised her rapier and introduced herself as a spade knight named Brow. She said that they would fight her, then use the sliding wind skill and threw the opponent's back. The bandits were clearly surprised that the girl turned out to be a mage, and one of them ordered to stop her from using magic. Brow became angry and said that the only thing that awaited whoever only touched a hair of spade was death. The girl leaped high into the air, and the bandits froze in shock that she could still fly. Even among mages, flight was a terribly rare thing, but from the looks of it, the Brow seemed still a child. The bandits were confused and decided that there was no way they could defeat such a powerful mage. The girl created a wind wave and knocked half of the bandits down. The rest of the bandits, taking cover from the wind, decided that they would take the girls from the wagon as hostages, but a Sunsui stood in their way. The hero introduced himself as a swordsman named Shirokuro Sunsui that he would fight them back. But the bandits ordered him out of the way, threatening the lad with death. Sunsui used his sword's eye skill and struck the nearest bandit in the head. The attackers stared at the guy in puzzlement, not realizing what just happened. Before they could do anything, the hero was behind one of the bandits, grabbed his head and used the release of the Kai. The bandit crashed into a tree with terrible force and punched it with his head. Meanwhile, the brouhaha told the bandits that they were nothing against her wind. After a few moments, all the bandits were defeated and lay unconscious on the ground. Brow told my lady that they had made it. In doing so, not a single bandit was able to escape from them. Dewey smiled and told Brow that she was as ostentatious as ever and Sunsui was as simple as ever. It was very dark though and she couldn't get a good look. Brow replied to my lady that she was sorry, and the hero thought she was being picky as usual. It was a real disappointment to Dewey, but she told the boys to hurry up and get in, for they were getting out of here. After this their wagon moved on. Dewey reassured Rain and said that everything was fine, for these two took care of the bad guys. Sunsui wished she would also show a drop of kindness to him and Brow as well. The next day, the main characters arrived at the Royal Harness Academy. Dewey had never seen the best academy in the country, the Royal Arcana Academy, before. The hero was also surprised that it was more imposing than he thought. Dewey wanted to know the Sunsui's opinions, and the guy replied that they would look into it further. But undoubtedly he felt a strong magical aura. Dewey asked Rain's opinion, but the girl thought My Lady's house was far more impressive. Suddenly, the doors in front of them opened, and the woman said that for the daughter of one of the 4 great families, her academy looked boring. Dewey was thrilled that a great sage and part-time principal of this academy appeared before them. The woman smiled and said that the principal was quite enough for her self-loving princess. It seemed to Dewey that the principal would have preferred to be called a magician. But the woman said she would rather be called principal, because the title of magician reminded her that she had already lived quite a long life. The girl bowed and agreed with her. It was a given that they would be under her wing from now on, and Dewey asked to lend them her guidance and support. The woman laughed, thinking that their school could teach them something their family's teachers had not given them. Sunsui found their interaction quite unusual, and he thought that the two got along quite well. The headmaster replied that surely someone here was as blessed as they were and was easily starting to get bored. Although she was already quite old, there were still many interesting things in this world. The principal had already heard that the Dewey Guard was practicing the sage art, and it was such a rare ability that even she hadn't heard of it. The woman would like to ask the hero to demonstrate it to her students, that is, to put on a show. Dewey squinted at her guard and wasn't sure about it. Sunsui thought it was a very problematic request. Even though he had trained for 500 years, he could still only use the 4 sage techniques. The first one was light stepping, which reduced his weight and the weight of everything he touched. The second, a flickering step that allowed him to cover long distances in an instant. A sword energy skill, infusing his sword with energy, making it as heavy and strong as steel. An energy discharge, infusing things he touches with energy, as well as allowing him to hit them or throw them away. Even after 500 years of training, he was only good at these techniques. Moreover, they were also mundane and not so spectacular. The mistress knew that very well, and the guy hoped that she wouldn't want the Sunsui to show them what he could do. It was obvious from her face that she was pondering her answer. The director gave a sly grin and told Dewey that the betrayal heiress was bragging about her guard's techniques. A sinister dark aura immediately began to emanate from Dewey as soon as she heard about it. Dewey immediately turned to the frightened hero, and thought that since this was the case, they could have an exhibition match. In that case, she might as well agree. The principal was pleased and thanked the girl for her agreement. Somehow the hero knew it would end like this. The heroes walked to the Royal Arcana Academy to their stadium where they came face to face with their opponents. This was the first time Sunsui saw the heiress of a powerful family like Spade. Standing in front of him was a Batral heiress named Happen Batral. Happen and Dewey were equal in status. Happen smiled at Dewey and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Dewey snidely replied that Happen was so inconspicuous that she could not recall the last time they had met. The hero was well aware that his mistress was too proud and always tried to be taller than her peers. In any case, it seemed to him that her guards were using rare abilities. One of the girls turned to the others and told them to do what they wanted. Meanwhile, she would go wait for her turn. The girl who was shorter also asked her to excuse herself and followed her partner. The hero sensed that these two were not in the mood to fight, but he was much more worried about the Japanese man across from him. He was wearing faux leather boots and a synthetic fabric blazer. On top of that, he was interacting with the heiress in a different way than it was appropriate to behave with one of the 4 families. After all of the above, the hero had no doubt that he was definitely Japanese. The guy told the Happen that she shouldn't have gotten involved in the bickering here. Sunsui saw that he didn't just have a rare ability, but he also had a trick that allowed him to repel any type of magic. There were quite a lot of spectators gathered in the stadium and people were eagerly whispering amongst themselves. Sunsui, Brow and My Lady also took their spectator seats and watched the start. The headmistress came out to the center of the stadium and announced that 4 people practicing rare abilities would show their skills today. The first to come out was to be a princess of the distant kingdom of Majin, named Suni Majin. Suni asked for the power of the founder king to be granted to her, magic that could wrap her as a powerful beast as long as her body contained royalty from the age of myths. With those words, her entire body pulsed. The girl asked the Great Lion, the protector of the royal family, to take her body and steal this land with her greatness. Lady Suni applied her skill of divine possession, after which she reincarnated into a huge terrifying beast. The huge snarling beast wanted to hear their opinions. The girl in beast form said that it was her family's secret hereditary ability. The principal was as surprised as everyone else in the stands. It was the first time people had seen such magic. In addition, some of them even jumped up from surprise. The principal exclaimed that it was a wonderful magic, and people quietly began to discuss this ability with each other. No one had thought that they would get a chance to see such a rare magic from a distant land. And to everyone, it was simply marvelous. Satisfied with herself, Suni returned to her original appearance. The next girl had to use the cursed magic. Usually people didn't even notice her, but it was still worth a closer look. The seemingly insecure girl with the staff thanked the principal and introduced herself as Isekai'd. She said that once she activated her curse magic, she would generate the power of the curse, and with that power, she could change things. The girl took the staff with both hands and raised it above her head. Her power collapsed onto the sword that was stuck into the board near the headmaster. The sword seemed to go limp and fell to the ground. Everyone was convinced that this was the cursed power of the Saikyou family, and it was also passed down from their ancestors by inheritance. The astonished principal picked up the collapsed sword and exclaimed that it was marvelous. She thanked the girls for kindly showing them their powers. Suni thought it wasn't that impressive, but Suga just smiled and thanked the principal. Next, the principal was going to introduce the ones they were all waiting for. The strongest swordsman in the country and the future head of House Batrail appeared in the arena. Dewey told Sunsui that his victory was obvious, but he still should have shown them the difference in their statuses. Pepin meanwhile told Sega that he should have won and taken the title of strongest from the Spade family. Sunsui was embarrassed that there was so much pressure around. Dewey, along with Braun, sat in the front rows next to Rain and began to look forward to the start. The director introduced the first contestant. He was the guard, escort and escort convoy of the heiress of the Spade family, Shirokuro Sansui. He was also known as the Holy Sword with the face of a child. The character was the strongest swordsman in the Arcana Kingdom. Sunsui didn't tell anyone his age, but he hadn't changed in all the years that had passed, so it was clear where the child-face nickname came from. After 500 years, he still walked around with the face of a child, so he thought that this nickname was quite appropriate for him. In any case, he was standing behind the master, and the title of Sword Saint was embarrassing to him. The headmaster told the people that he was using a rare ability that even she had never seen before. It was called Art of the Sage. Everyone around started whispering among themselves again. Today, at the request of Ms. Dewey Spade, the performance will be a demonstration match. On the opposite side was Sire Mizu Sega. He was betrothed to Happen Batril and would be the next head of the Batril family. Sunsui was overcome with nostalgia at the sight of the living trope. The previous contestants, Ms. Suni Majin and Ms. Tsugasei, were also engaged to him. The director called it the truest youth, but the hero thought it was also a harem trope. Sir Sega used supportive magic. The principal thought it was the first time for the students to see an excellent protector in a real battle and asked them to watch him closely. The hero knew very well that supporting magic was the abilities of a Hitler and a defender, and he could heal people's wounds that way. Sega could also create walls and armor out of magic, which he did. The guy reincarnated into his armor and took his sword in his hands. He waited for his opponent to be ready, but Sunsui said he was already ready and asked him to start anytime. So far, the hero could only sense one type of energy, and if he didn't sense the rest, he thought the Sega would use one ability. Judging from the explanation, he could use other magic besides support, and that was his secret. Sunsui thought it was fine if he wanted to fight as a normal defender. Judging from the stance of his sword, he was an amateur who didn't know how to hold the weapon well. Oh, and the armor he made didn't look that sturdy either. Dewey watched the start of the duel with a smile while all the other spectators, including Happen, were in suspense and also waiting for the start. The hero decided to use a quick step to instantly get close and then a sword of energy to strike his armor. Sunsui thought it was supposed to knock out the opponent, but suddenly felt something else. Now the hero felt a different type of energy and the expression on his opponent's face changed. He assumed that the latter had read his mind or had foreseen the future. In general, it didn't matter because either option wouldn't affect the outcome of events anyway. With these thoughts, the hero used a quick step and quickly approached the sage. Sega had time to react to Sunsui's strike and blocked it with his sword. While he was using the blocking, the Sunsui released his energy discharge and aimed it directly at the guy's open chest. In an instant, the Sega slammed into the wall with terrible force and lost consciousness. The hero considered that this was the end of their fight. The director was shocked that their match was already over. No one could really see Sunsui's movements and thought he had teleported. People couldn't accurately explain what they saw, and no one understood anything. Rain jumped up happily and ran up to her father, who approached the girls. Dewey was as usual. Dewey was disappointed that it was pretty simple, even though she realized how cool he was. Sunsui felt embarrassed and apologized for it. The hero took Rain in his arms, who admired her cool father. Brow praised Sunsui and said it was great as always. She wondered if he couldn't have thrown a punch before he put up a defense. But speaking of that, the hero also wondered how the Seiga knew about his attack and prepared to repel it. That's why Sunsui changed his punch, which shocked the Brow. She didn't understand how Seiga could have anticipated the hero's strike. In all likelihood, he was hiding some sort of ability. The hero thought that Seiga had a lot of abilities from the god, but his training was weak. Happen and his team ran up to the guy and tried to bring him to his senses. The girls hoped he would wake up and were stunned by this outcome. The principal also approached the boy and asked the assistant to take the Seiga to the medic. Based on how quickly Seiga was knocked out, everyone realized how strong Dewey's security was. Lady Dewey laughed and said that she had only just been enlisted, but she had already seen something amazing. She was insanely happy to have arrived at this academy. In the infirmary, Seiga was put on a bed and after a while the guy started to come to his senses. As soon as he realized everything, Seiga clutched his head and thought that this defeat was quite humiliating. Happen exclaimed in tears that the wench's guard had tricked them. But Suni disagreed with Happen. That swordsman saw the Seiga's movement and then changed his attack. He was clearly heavily pumped and she noticed it. But Suni was in agreement that Seiga didn't use his full strength, and if he had put his full strength out there, he probably would have won. But Suga felt that there would then be a big problem if Shira Seiga's secret was revealed. Happen was sure she could deal with it, but she didn't want to see Seiga get hurt again. Seiga apologized for making her worry, but he really wanted to beat this guy up, even if he had to reveal his secret and use other magic. The inhabitants of this city, barring the rarest of exceptions, could only use one ability. They were born with that ability, no matter how hard one tried not to change it. People with magic could control the magic of the elements of fire, water, wind, and earth. Possessors of a wise heart could control space, gravity, and life forces, which was the art of the sage. Possessors of a royal heart could turn into beasts, which was divine mastery. Possessors of cursed magic could change the essence of an object, which was cursed magic. Possessors of holy magic could create armor and barriers, as well as heal wounds. Each of these abilities could be used differently, but it didn't matter what type of magic they had, unless of course they were the most exceptional of geniuses. Elemental magic, or some other rare magic taught by someone else, could not be used. As for Seigu, just like Sunsui, he was an ordinary Japanese schoolboy mistakenly killed by a god. This is still the same situation where a god killed a Japanese by mistake and then, apologizing, granted special abilities and sent him to the same world as Sunsui. The Seiga who used holy magic had more than just one elemental magic. Royal heart, cursed magic, and wise heart, he had all of these magic. And that was exactly what was his blessing. Currently, Seiga could use 4 different kinds of abilities. They are fire magic, holy armor magic, and divine mastery, as well as the lost magic that was only mentioned in the records. It was the bending of time to see the future. It was called the magic of divination. With training, he could also attain the art of the sage, and such abilities were to be called chit. In fear of the possibility of attracting too much attention, he decided to pretend to be able to use only one ability in public. To master them all, Seiga needed to train hard for years. Sunsui looked at the tired guy that had fallen to the ground. Everyone was shocked that Seiga had suffered an instant defeat again, even with all his abilities. The girls thought that Sunsui still fights the same way with all his speed. Sunsui saw that Seiga had too much confidence in his cheetah, and he challenged him to a duel the very day after his defeat. Seiga enchanted his sword with fire, created an armor of holy magic, and made himself stronger with divine mastery. Still, he overestimated his defense and speed, so he just foolishly swooped down on the hero with his sword over his head. The hero read everything and aimed at his torso. His speed helped him break his armor, and in the end the Seiga just crashed into Sunsui's weapon and passed out. Dewey said that once he started using abilities other than holy magic, she had some expectations, but it was still a disgrace. The girl thought it was a waste of time and suggested that the heroes go back to the academy. They left behind the puzzled girls that they were trying to bring the Seiga to their senses again. Dewey grudgingly turned to Sunsui and said that even if his opponent was weak, neglecting his task of entertaining her meant that he was not a successful guard. The hero merely apologized to his mistress. Dewey looked at the boy in surprise, and she thought it was just unbelievable. She didn't understand what Mother Rain could find in him. Along with that, it reminded her of something. Since their first meeting, the hero hadn't changed at all. By the way, the hero was a few years older than the girls. At that moment, Sunsui stared confusedly at the Dewey who suspected him. A few years, in fact, was still putting it mildly. Dewey had already noticed that he and Rain were not related by blood. And besides, there was no resemblance between them. In that case, she wondered if he had a woman he was interested in. The hero only spread his hands, saying that it wasn't like that. But he could not tell her that he was a sage who was 500 years old. Dewey thought that as a man with a perpetual poker face, he probably wanted a sensual, extravagant relationship. Sunsui didn't know what she meant, for during his studies with the master he had learned to avoid urges such as lust. In that case, the brouhaha was clear, and her face showed obvious embarrassment. Dewey and Sunsui looked at the girl in surprise. Brow replied that it was slightly problematic for him, who had no interest in romance. The guys were surprised and did not expect such a response from Brow herself. Meanwhile, Seiga had come to his senses and looked at Sunsui and clenched his fist in anger. It had been a month since Mrs. Dewey's arrival at the academy. One day the principal was giving a lecture to the students in the office. She was telling them that by using holy magic, they could create armor to protect their bodies. At first, even though the hero didn't dare to utter a word, he thought that Dewey would get tired. But to his surprise, Dewey diligently attended the principal lessons. According to the headmaster, one day a certain researcher decided to create armor to protect his body. But he was a fire mage, so the armor turned out to be fire. And the only thing this guy accomplished was to be burned alive. The principal was lecturing on failures in the vastness of magical research. Sunsui thought it would be educational for Dewey, but the lectures only elicited her laughter, which was certainly out of place. The lesson the students should have learned from this mishap was simple. There was never any need to test magic on themselves. Also, the protagonist had some things change in his personal life. Brow almost imperceptibly flashed her gaze at the protagonist. The hero had known Brow since he was a child, and he was surprised that this period had already arrived. Baby Rain was now making new friends in kindergarten. Clearly, he was the reason for Brow to develop an interest in romance. But Mrs. Dewey and Rain began to tease her about it. Sunsui could tell that it was a very uncomfortable situation. Their mistress also had another mansion near the academy. As for the Hapana team, Seiga was constantly thinking about their defeat and was quite pensive. Every time, Rain and Dewey peeked at Sunsui and Brow when they were alone. The girl said that if anything happened, she would count on the hero to be able to deal with it. Sunsui answered her that it was okay, she could rely on him. Brow thought he didn't mean that he would protect her. Sunsui agreed with her, but didn't understand why Brow was always blushing and so worried when talking to him. Brow noticed that Sunsui's face changed and wanted to know the reason. The hero said with horror that the current and past chapters are coming here right now. From the balcony of the mansion, an entire army of troops could be seen moving towards the mansion. Just like Sunsui said, it was the chapter's cavalry unit, but the equipment on them was not for just traveling between residences. Dewey wondered if they'd read the letter she'd sent the other day, and decided it was a pretty bad time. The boys immediately wondered what kind of nonsense she had written in that letter. The rider at the head of the army shouted that they were going to die, and Rain told her father that she was scared. Dewey hugged the girl and sarcastically said that they had a frightened child here, so Sunsui needed to calm them down. The hero understood and turned to the Brow. He asked to take care of the mistress if they were attacked. After this request, the hero swiftly approached the enemy and stunned him, then stopped his horse. The whole army was puzzled and stopped by the hero, and thought that the very holy sword was before them. One of the horsemen of the army turned out to be Dewey's father, who, as usual, pounced upon the lad with accusations in the direction of his daughter. Sunsui thought he was energetic as usual and promptly found himself on the head of his galloping horse. No sooner did Dewey's father notice the lad than he received a blow on the head with Sunsui's sword. The hero carefully backed the man up and placed him on the horse's back. One of the troops apologized for worrying about it, but the hero replied that it was fine. After all, they were furious about Mrs. Dewey anyway. Sunsui was embarrassed and felt that they should have been the ones to apologize to them. The soldiers replied that they would continue on their way to Madame's mansion, and the guy asked them to take their time. Brow felt sorry, for she had been devoting too little time to her duties lately, but Sunsui only smiled and asked her not to worry about it. The girl thought it was hard for him, and the hero knew it was strange for him to say such a thing. But he did pay too much attention to her. At that moment, the guy thought that if this had happened before he became a sage, he would have been over the moon. While Seiga was riding in the carriage, his sword asked his master not to worry. After all, he, the strongest divine sword, was by his side. Seiga smiled and replied to the sword that he was right. Therefore, he offered the execs to fight with him together. Later, the army reached the brow and the mansion itself. They bowed to the heroes, after which they went back out. Father and his older brother Dewey stayed with the protagonists. While drinking a cup of tea, older brother Dewey said that they were full of enemies, and if they weren't capable of protecting his sweet little sister, it was hard to call them her protector. The thoughtful father said that they had passed this unannounced exam with excellent results. It seemed to the hero that they were remorseful, but still wished they were much more ashamed. All the knights immediately left, and they were sent here for almost no reason. But the father had something to say to his dear daughter just in case. With those words, he took out an envelope and loudly placed it on the table. Dewey seemed to already know the topic of conversation and only smirked slyly. The letter in question said that he and Sansui were married only in words, and that Brower would give birth in her place. At least that was the gist of this letter. Hearing this, the Brower was shocked and blushed. Father coughed and expressed his opinion. He suggested that it was too early for such talk. Eldest brother supported father and was in complete agreement with him. The uncomprehending Rini looked at the puzzled Sansui. If they were talking about a wedding between Brow and Sansui, then brother Dewey could arrange for the hero to get a suitable position to marry the daughter of a Brow nobleman. However, Dewey's father could not approve of the marriage between her and Sansui, and of all her whims, he refused to consider only this one. In that case, Dewey assumed that she could marry anyone of her choice. In any case, they had another issue that was raised in this letter. It seemed to Sansui that this was quite a strong change of subject of conversation. Dewey's father wanted to know about the Batral girl's fiancé, and if he was really capable of using any sorcery. They knew at least that he was capable of using holy magic, elemental magic, and divine spell possession. In that case, Father Dewey felt he had no choice but to consider him a threat. Now Dewey's older brother could see why the Barthable house had chosen to accept him. However, it looked like Seiga was still no match for Sansui. Dewey haughtily said that it was true, and that there was no way her protector would lose to some trained lucky guy. He did live up to the nickname of the face-to-face child with the holy sword as the strongest swordsman. And the elder brother believed that the strength of the Sansui elevated their status. But the hero believed that compared to the master Suoboku, he could be considered an amateur. There was an awkward pause. Father thought about it every time the hero talked about his master. Not even the Imperial Guard was capable of touching a Sansui. And if his teacher was rumored to be even stronger than him, his father had no idea who he was. His older brother also knew he needed a teacher, but frankly, he couldn't even imagine one. Dewey wished she could understand and recognize what his appearance looked like. What was more unimaginable to her was that there was such a large gap in strength. The hero thought that the Suoboku master could really be called a god, especially if after all Sansui was the strongest. Dewey's father suggested that a fellow named Seiga had the heart of a sage, and perhaps he had been trained by his master in the art of the sage as well. But the hero replied that this simply couldn't be the case, so they could take it easy. Just the basic knowledge alone took him 500 years, and it also seemed that the Seiga couldn't copy skills just by seeing them. Dewey suggested that they stop talking about the lucky man. She would like to return to the discussion of the marriage between Sansui and Brower. The father agreed with his daughter, but neither the Sansui nor the Brower knew what they were talking about. Sansui thought he sensed some sort of aura, and it was apparently not human. A carriage with a group of Happiness pulled up to their mansion. The girl bowed and greeted the current head and former head as well as Dewey. Happina threw a displeased look at her. Dewey seemed interested in another rematch, but she wasn't interested in their little group. Besides, she was attracted to more important things. Happina thought she was saying that because she was afraid of losing. The thing was that the Seiga was summoned by the wielder of the divine sword. She pointed to a guy who was indeed holding a certain sword in his hands. Dewey's father was shocked that one of the 8 divine treasures was in his hands. The sword shone and told everyone present that it was true. Everyone looked in surprise at the sword that was shrouded in light and lifted up from the ground. The sword took the form of a short child that introduced himself as a divine sword named Exex. Rain was delighted, and that the sword could turn into a little girl. The creature said that it was created by a god as the strongest sword. Sansui immediately thought of the old god who sent him to this world. Seigu felt a shiver and clenched his hand into a fist. In order to defeat Sansui, and for Exex to recognize him, he had been working himself to death for the past month, and was confident that this time he would prevail. Meanwhile, the hero couldn't understand how he could brag about working for a whole month. Brow also didn't understand how a month of training could change anything about him. Earlier, a conversation between Hapina and her group and her father took place at Bathrable Manor. They told their father about the situation that happened to them earlier. The girl apologized to her father because she was so disappointed that she had revealed the secret of Seiga Dewey. The father had already realized that even Seiga could not scratch this saint with his sword. Seiga was disappointed, for despite using all his strength, he could not defeat him. His father took out a certain key from his pocket and told the boy that he was too greedy, and if he continued like this, his rare talent would just rot away. The father went to the shelves of books and took out a small chest from there. He told the boy that since his current goal was to become stronger, perhaps he could pull out a sword for himself. The father took out a map from the chest and held it out to the surprised sage. This map showed the location of the strongest magic sword called Isekai'd. The whole group was shocked because it was the same sword from the legends. In addition, no one even thought that it could be in this country. It was created before the Arcana Kingdom was even founded here. Using the power of a swordsman, one could destroy an entire country with this sword. Seiga immediately thought that if he had this sword, he would definitely defeat the Sunsui. After that, they traveled to the destination point on the map. After going through the depths of the forest, they came across a cave that looked quite ominous. Seiga entered the cave and saw a glowing sword in the middle of the darkness. The sword was stuck into a large rock, and it was undoubtedly the same magic sword. The weapon spoke to Seiga's group and decided that another people had come that wanted to take possession of it. The sword ordered them to leave, for there was no man who could handle it. The boy shouted that he had an opponent he wanted to defeat no matter what, but the sword believed that everyone had similar desires. However, they were all weaklings compared to the swordsman that sealed him here. But Seiga was not going to give up and said that he was an unusual person. He demonstrated his power and said that he got it from the god himself. The weapon saw that he was telling the truth, and the guy didn't look like a peasant. In that case, he asked for permission to assess his passion and aspirations. Seiga demonstrated his strength and with one blow cut a large stone right in front of the sword. The girls were delighted with the Seiga, and from then on he took possession of that sword. Coming back to the present, the main character had to fight the Seiga and his sword. Dewey's older brother acted as referee and asked the boys to stand across from each other. He made sure that both sides were ready for battle. But Seiga noticed that Sunsui still hadn't pulled out his sword. In any case, he was going to put out his full power and ordered the execs to act. Both sides prepared for battle and Big Brother Dewey signaled for the fight to begin. Seiga clenched his magic sword that shone with the fiery soul of execs. The ability of this magic sword was to enhance magic powers and grand shining armor. It also utilized maximum flames. Guy asked the god destroyer Disaster Wolf to heed his call and destroy his enemies. With those words, he used the divine mastery skill and reincarnated into a beast. Even Big Brother Dewey was amazed at his abilities. With these spells, Seiga's offensive strength, defensive strength, and physical abilities had clearly increased. He became visibly stronger and his sorcery prediction also improved. He could now see a few seconds ahead and decided to go on the attack. Clad in his wolf form, the sword-wielding Seiga used a rock-cutting inferno blade. But as it was, seeing a few seconds from the future only meant that he would try to deal with the things that would happen in those seconds. Sunsui didn't even pull out his blade, but only swiftly approached his opponent. Using an easy step, he ended up at the wolf's back before toppling it to the ground. At some point, the sword slipped out of the Seiga's hands and into the hands of the surprised Sunsui. The hero understood perfectly well the reason why Seiga had lost to him. He had a clear lack of training, and the simple fact that this opponent was in his worst match. Sunsui pointed the Seiga's blade at him and said that this contest was over. In the end, the Seiga was defeated, and everything happened exactly as he had predicted. Prediction is a skill that allowed him to see what would happen, but only what was in his field of vision. Because of this, the sword saw what the Seiga was doing. Shortly after he lost the Seiga, the vision of the Seiga was pointing to the sky, and it ended just like that. Dewey didn't realize what had happened, but it seemed to her that it was already over. Hapina didn't understand how the hero dared to do that, and how he was able to defeat the Seiga itself so quickly. The girl thought that Seiga had trained quite hard and couldn't have lost to the hero so quickly. But they had to accept that Sunsui had far surpassed Seiga. Hapina was terribly offended, for he had worked hard and didn't understand how this could have happened. The step of light did not only extend to everything it touched. At that moment, Sunsui reduced the weight of the Seiga, so his sword flipped him over and he fell to the ground. And that was the only thing he did. Dewey's father was shocked that the hero was able to overpower this guy who had such a huge amount of energy with one touch, and couldn't believe his eyes. Sunsui felt the fearful looks of the Seiga girls on him and glanced in their direction. Father Dewey had always thought that Sunsui was hiding his power, but now he thought he was stronger than he had realized. However, Seiga remained confused, but there was someone who could remember execution and perfect movement. Only one person could do it, and the magic sword recognized it. XX could not believe it, and assumed that the hero was a disciple of the Suiboku. At this point, it seemed to everyone that the Shunsui was surprised by the sword's words. Naturally, the hero was curious how he knew about his teacher. The child-shaped sword cried and said that Suiboku left him to get the god's seat, and because of his movements, he knew that Shunsui was his disciple. The hero did not understand what he meant, and did not know that Suiboku could have been a god. At some point, the hero realized what Suiboku meant when he read his letter from the god. It was for this reason that he knew him. Everyone looked at the thoughtful Shunsui with astonishment. According to the head of the family, its previous owner had lived a long time before the kingdom was founded. Dewey also wondered about the Master Sansui's former owner and looked at his brother. The history of the secret kingdom was long, and that person surely couldn't still be alive. Brow suggested that it was most likely that Master Sansui was one of his descendants, but the sword exclaimed that it was impossible. The fact is that Suiboku was a hermit. The sword face wept and could not believe it. He remembered the moment when Suiboku brought him to that dark cave, and begging forgiveness left him in that stone. At that moment, the boy only wanted to become the strongest and not depend on anything. With these words, he stuck his sword into the stone. As he was leaving, Exex asked him to stop, but Suiboku left. Thinking back to that day, Exex sobbed and asked only for Suiboku to come back to him. Everyone looked at the sword in shock and remained silent. Suddenly, the hero told them that the hermit could have lived for 1,000 years, and his words stunned everyone around him. The weeping sword asked the disciple of the Suiboku to answer his question. The hero had never heard of the sword Suiboku before, but still he allowed that his master could have been the man he was talking about. Dewey began to speculate about something and asked the guy to give her a straight answer. She wanted to know his real age, but Shunsui admitted that he didn't remember it exactly himself. He recalled the time of his apprenticeship with the Suiboku. Shunsui replied that he had been training with his master for about 500 years. This information shocked everyone present, including the Seigu who had come to his senses. When the whole Dewey and Shunsui family walked into the room, the girl told the guy that it felt like betrayal. After all, the hero had kept some pretty important information from them, but the older brother asked his sister to stop. He couldn't call it pure deception. The father said that they had been with him for 5 years and trusted him, and it was just quite unexpected, and that kind of thing was hard to take. And now when it comes down to it, they're going to let him reveal all the secrets. They won't ask the Shunsui to provide proof, but they'll believe what he tells them. The hero realized that he had no point in hiding anything and told them everything as it really was. He told them how he was born in another world, and about the god who had killed him by mistake, about how he became the chief disciple of the Suiboku by the will of the gods, about how he trained with the sword for 500 years, and then about more recently. The boy told about what happened in the forest and how he found the rain. Apparently, it was also hard for her, but she only clenched her small fist silently. Dewey's older brother saw that it was hard to believe and thanked him for telling them everything. His father also believed him, but not because of his words, but only because of the behavior and strength he had shown so far. And he was indeed worthy to be called a holy sword with a baby face. Dewey glanced at the boy sullenly and assumed that there was no more lies between them. But Shunsui replied that he had already told them everything. She wanted to make sure that it was all true. He talked about how he practiced swinging his sword, or that he could only use 4 skills. But Shunsui could swear that it was true. But for him to have swung the sword for so long, or the fact that he only knew 4 skills in all that time, was too much for her to believe. But the hero swore it was true. For 500 years, all he had done was swing a sword, and the only skills he could learn were 4 skills. Dewey sighed tiredly and admitted that she didn't understand these sages at all. In that case, it was understandable to Dewey's father why Segaka had such a hard time with him. Dewey's older brother suggested that the art of the sages could not be imitated by ordinary people. Rain turned to her father and said she wanted to ask him something. She wondered why he had given her that particular name. She was shocked when she found out the reason. The fact was that when the maid asked for her name, he made up her name on the spot. The girl shouted all over the mansion saying that she hated her father. Toward nightfall, the lights were still on in the Batrable mansion. A dead silence descended on the room where Hapana's father and her team were located. When they told her father that the boy was 500 years old, it seemed no surprise to him that he was so strong. Exex didn't have any details about him though, and he's quite young for a sage. It was his primary way of fighting with a sword, and he hadn't learned many arts yet. Hapana wasn't sure if it was worth calling a 500-year-old man young. It turns out that there were several legends of sages in the Majin Kingdom. They could raise mountains and control clouds. Suni always thought they were fairy tales, but execs said it was true. After all, Suiboku once lifted a giant mountain into the sky. He also controlled the weather as he pleased. Seiga still couldn't believe that he had been training for 500 years, and meanwhile he was bragging about his month of training. At this point, what Happina wanted most of all was to know the reason why Saga had decided to become Dewey's escort in everything. X was wondering what they would do now. He wanted to know if Seiga was going to challenge the Suiboku disciple again. But Seiga doubted his answer. He was interrupted by Tsuga that ran up to the guy and leaned against his palm. She clearly disagreed. She begged the surprised Seigu to stop fighting with Sansui Sir. The girl didn't want to see the way Sir Sansui was hurting him. Besides, they had already fought him 3 times in a row, and that should have been enough. She decided to find out why he needed to fight him in the first place. At this point, Happina's father thought she had told what they were all wondering. The master might not want to hear it, but X asked him not to be stupid. In order for a master to defeat a Suiboku disciple, in addition to the sage art, the master must fully learn all other rare skills. In addition, the master would have to spend many decades in training, but that was still a bit much. Tsuga wanted to take Seiga's promise that he wouldn't fight Sansui-sama again. The guy got embarrassed and promised he wouldn't do it again. Seiga walked out into the courtyard and looked up to the night stars. He had never imagined that a hero could train for 500 years and was impressed. Several days have since passed since the duel. The landlady was now resting in the drawing room on a sofa. The girl watched as Rain gave the hero a lecture. Rain assumed that her father had already guessed the reason why she was angry, and Sansui understood her perfectly. The fact that they were not blood relatives. Rain had already realized it herself, so she wasn't angry about it, but there was another reason. When she found out about her name, she started talking about it every chance she got. The girl screamed that he couldn't just give her a name on the spot. She wished her father had spent more time when thinking about the name. The hero knelt down and offered his most sincere apology, but the girl did not deny that she liked it after all. Looking at the whole scene, Dewey smugly smirked. Someone knocked on the door and asked about Dewey. It was Heppen, who wanted to bother the girl a little. Everyone unanimously decided that they wanted to call Sansui for another match. But when the whole group of Heppen entered the room, Seiga bowed his head to the heroes and admitted his defeat. Dewey only waved her hands and said that he had lost 3 times in a row, and said nothing. And so she was thrilled that he was only talking about it now. Finally, Seiga was ready to give up, and apparently he was still not satisfied with it. But there was nothing more he could do about it. Dewey replied to the guy that the ability to surrender was also a sign of growth. He could agree with her. Besides, his stupid actions had gotten them into a lot of trouble. Dewey wondered in that case what they really wanted from them. Seiga just didn't want to believe that he could lose and would want to defeat the Sansui no matter what. But the girl thought it was just idiotic, and Seiga agreed with her. Seiga surprised his group with the news that he would now only use his power to protect everyone. The hero thought he was trying to say something cool, but if his attack had hit him earlier, there would have been no trace of him. It was like some kind of strange fate for the legendary sword found by the Seigek. After all, it turned out to be the same sword wielded by its master. Execs asked for a change of topic and admitted that he had mixed feelings about a Suiboku apprentice serving a layman. Rain suggested that Suiboku-san had never worked for anyone, and that was correct. The hero couldn't even imagine a time when his master was young. Dewey was suddenly all glowing, for she was very interested in hearing about the kind of man he was. Axex thought for a moment and said that he didn't want to discuss it in front of his current master, but if they insisted on it, he could tell them. Suiboku was an extremely vain and ambitious man. His personality was such that it was quite unthinkable for him to serve for anyone. Everyone around him didn't understand where his reluctance to talk about his master had gone. Axex meanwhile continued his story. No one knew how many countries were destroyed after they incurred his wrath, but his master also expressed his character in other ways. Suiboku could cause volcanoes to erupt. While the execs were proudly talking about their master, no one noticed the mysterious man eavesdropping under their doors. Suiboku was turning forests into wastelands by practicing his skills. Shunsui suddenly felt uncomfortable at the thought of his master doing so many crazy things. But Rain was thrilled that her father was the apprentice of such a powerful man. The hero wasn't sure how to treat past masters, but if Rain felt better, he would just be happy with it. By the way, Shunsui was curious how his master was doing. Meanwhile, the mysterious people approached the supposed grave in the forest. One of the cloaked men wished it had a name on it. While they were scrutinizing the supposed grave, a dark-haired young man stealthily approached them and called out to the boys. Suiboku told the boys that grave robbing was not a good thing. The 2 strangers immediately pulled out knives, but Suiboku spread his hands and told them to calm down. After all, in all likelihood, they had drawn their swords for more than a mere show. Suiboku suggested that they wanted to know about the man who lay in that grave. Apparently his words interested the strangers, and they stopped. Suiboku continued the story and said that about 5 years ago, a woman with a baby with gray hair came here and was attacked by wolves. They were too late to help her, so he buried her here. The strangers wanted to know what happened to the gray-haired infant. Suiboku smiled and replied that his disciple had taken her with him, and in all likelihood, she was now being raised in the human world. At least, she was definitely not in this forest. The mysterious people under the hoods glanced amongst themselves, then silently headed back to the forest. Suiboku was happy that these people didn't start questioning him. There was no way he could guess what exactly they wanted. But now this story was already about his student, and Sunboku was curious how Sunsui was doing. The long-haired girl walked into the woman's office and reported that they couldn't find anything about him wherever they looked, and there was no hint of his identity. The long-haired girl turned out to be the first princess of the secret kingdom named Arcana Stand. The academy principal smiled and assumed that the princess knew what rumors were. They're just like a jar full of moths, and once they escape, they're everywhere. Arcana started talking about Shirokiro Sunsui, who was actually a swordsman who was over 500 years old. She squeezed the paper in her hand and admitted that it was hard to believe, but knowing the depth of his power, it made sense. The principal smiled and said that Master Seigaka was also considerably skilled, though he couldn't defeat Master Sunsui, and it turned out to be exactly as they thought. He was probably superior to the royal guards, but he could still get stronger. Arcana looked through the window at the sky and thought that the royal family couldn't afford to lag behind. They had to find a great support, someone like Betrel's Seiga. The princess told the headmaster that they had to have someone with strength and ability. They need someone who could compete with a Sunsui, more specifically a lightning blade. Meanwhile, Dewey was once again drilling the hero with her suspicious gaze. She really thought he was older than them, but not by 500 years. Once the rain's mood had cleared, it was now the mistress' turn, and the hero had to listen to her. Sunsui apologized to her most sincerely for keeping silent about it. In that case, Dewey decided that the brow situation now needed to be reassessed. She could not tell her to marry some 500-year-old grandfather. But as far as the hero was concerned, he would still look the same in 10 or 20 years as he did now. Dewey speculated what might have happened if they had gotten married. After all, Seiga was also betrothed to Heppen. The girl covered her face and decided that this discussion should be postponed. She pictured the marriage of Brawa and Sunsui again and decided that now was not the time to think about it. Besides, she had to find someone for herself as well, someone whose looks and lineage would match hers, and whose personality wouldn't embarrass her, someone who could earn the approval of her father and older brother. But the hero doubted they would find someone who could do that. While the protagonists were in the room, someone knocked on their mansion. It turned out to be a knight who asked for an apology and introduced himself as a messenger from the Caputo family. He wished to speak to Lady Isekai'd and asked if she was free. The knight had an urgent delivery in the form of a stamped letter. Dewey became curious about what the Caputo family wanted with her and allowed the knight into their room. The knight got down on his knee and handed the girl the letter. He said that this letter had been written in a hurry by the landlady from a patent of Caputo palates. Dewey took the envelope in her hands with interest. The letter said that Padona Miss Isekai'd. The letter apologized to the girl for her rudeness in not reporting it directly. The fact is that a very experienced swordsman arrived today from a foreign land, and he demanded that they send here the strongest swordsman in the country. She was ready to give them more details when they met. The girl asked them to come to the Caputadomen with Sir Shirokuro Sunsui. After all, the only person who can defeat him is the holy sword with the baby face Sir Sunsui, and no one else. The letter was signed by Palette Caputo herself. Along with the House of Betrel and the House of Sopai, they were one of the 4 great noble families. Since she was talking, this must be an unorthodox case. Dewey decided to make sure that the messenger was aware of the contents of this message, and the knight confirmed her words. She wondered about this strange swordsman from another country. Dewey wanted to know if he was really handsome and young. The knight was surprised by this question, but he replied that the fellow was quite young and dashing. It seemed to Dewey that the fellow behaved very refined and he was probably from a good family. He was so strong that only a Sunsui could defeat him, and he is a refined, well-mannered, and handsome man. Dewey was sure that only this man could be worthy enough for her. The girl jumped up from her seat and told the boys that they were going to visit the Caputos. After a while, the protagonists reached Caputo territory. As they walked through the town, the protagonists noticed that there were many homeless and poor people. The soldier who escorted them out apologized for disturbing them. even if they had just arrived. Their pallid mistress wanted to welcome them, and the knight would like to take the Sunsui to her. It was very late, but Mistress Dewey had no fiancé. Normally she would have gotten married at a very young age, but these two perverts would never let her get engaged. Nevertheless, it seemed to the hero that even without them, the mistress had never before shown interest in a man. Rain decided to ask something of the brouhaha. She wondered if their mistress would like this swordsman. It was also an interesting question for the brouhaha, and she was sure he had his own circumstances too. Sunsui looked at the girls and decided that it was a reasonable concern. Besides, he didn't think it could have worked out so easily. Nevertheless, he was aware of it. As they made their way deeper into the city, the heroes noticed a large gathering of people. Everyone was curious about what was going on around them, and apparently some sort of fight was going on. Dewey wondered why there were so many people here. From the conversations of the people, it was clear that the noblemen and the foreign swordsmen were fighting with each other. They were wondering how strong he was, and Dewey was interested in that. The young and handsome swordsman aimed his weapon at his opponent that was lying on the ground. He used powerful magnetism and smiled, saying that he wouldn't give up his head so easily. Around the young man, the soldiers he had defeated earlier were already lying on the ground. Sunsui felt uneasy at the sight of such a happy and in love Dewey. Her eyes seemed to burn and her cheeks blushed. Now Rain and Brow had no doubt that she liked him. The hero noticed that at this moment the whole world seemed to revolve around this guy. In the midst of the people, a girl came out to the heroes that she was happy to see them. This one turned out to be Palette Caputo herself, who apologized for the notice. Dewey surmised that everything she had written in her letter concerned this very situation, and the girl confirmed her guess. The other day, a Ton who came from a foreign country and Sir Nuri, a nobleman from the Domino Empire, made a great fuss here. They both said they were right, and neither wished to stand trial. The Domino Empire was a country that neighbored the Secret Kingdom, and just recently there had been a revolution there. The entire imperial family was captured, but the nobles migrated to the Arcana and sought refuge in various places. These nobles were not criminals or anything, and they were accepted. However, problems began to arise everywhere, and the exact cause was unknown. Sir Nuri then led his soldiers out. It was clear as day that something was wrong here. Dewey suggested that it must be a good thing to just give this noble loser to the dominoes. But the Palette exclaimed that this was not going to happen. They needed to listen carefully to both sides and determine what was the truth. Swordsman thought he had nothing to feel guilty about, but he just wouldn't allow himself to be dragged into this. And if they wanted him to speak, someone had to defeat him first. With a smile on his face, the guy turned to Mr. Holy Swordsman with a baby face. Dewey smirked and assumed that Sunsui already knew what to do. She asked him to stick to it so his opponent wouldn't get injured. Palette would also like to ask him to be gentle with that person and not to hurt him. The hero drew his weapon and asked that this be granted to him. As he entered the battlefield, he turned his attention to the soldiers he had defeated earlier. A gloating smirk only appeared on the Domino's face. He didn't understand how it was possible that the guy was holding back and not hurting anyone. Even he was a noble, but his loyal soldiers had lost to him, and he thought that this shabby guy would surely lose to this swordsman. But if these rich girls appreciate the boy and the boy dies, this impertinent foreigner will definitely be punished for it. And if the kid is actually an amazing swordsman, then the foreigner will just die. Domino thought that no matter what, he would get something out of it. The swordsman introduced himself as Tun, and as the strongest swordsman in this country, he asked for permission to know the hero's name. Sunsui introduced himself and said it was a pleasure to meet him. Even Brow could feel this guy's energy and realized he was quite strong. Dewey thought Fawn was strong and handsome, also with status, and she had nothing to complain about here. Brow thought that having that kind of luck was actually pretty amazing. Rain cheered for her father and told Sunsui that she believed in him. When both sides had prepared for battle and everyone was eagerly watching the battle begin, Ton used the true death dance skill. Everyone watched in amazement as Ton created his clones at great speed and approached Sunsui. But the hero had a great reaction and blocked the enemy's sword strike. The hero struck one of the clones, then got behind the other and struck him in the head with his sword. The hero's skill seemed quite interesting to the Ton, and he applied the skill, the dance of exciting shadows. Several clones in a row descended on the hero, but Sunsui dealt with them in an instant. At the moment of the fight, one could clearly see the opponents smiling at each other. Dewey noticed that this guy could make perfect copies of himself, and it must be a rare magic. Palette was delighted with the battle and praised Sir Sunsui. Rain didn't seem to stop marveling at her father's strength, but his opponent wasn't bad either. Sunsui realized that Ton was indeed trying to crush him. and earlier he thought that it was rather strange that all the soldiers had a lot of scratches. The hero thought that the Ton could exert precise control, but only when he had one copy. But even if this ability was taken away, he was still very skilled and a swordsman. The factor was his physical strength. He was probably only slightly stronger than a Brow. Ton thought it was worth it to leave his homeland and travel far. He couldn't even imagine that such a strong swordsman could have met him in this country. Ton thought that Sunsui was worthy of seeing his secret skill. The guy exclaimed that this was his last attack and prepared to attack. At that moment, many spears formed behind him. Everyone was surprised at how many spears a Ton could actually create. Ton called it the true shadow dance, and all the copies including him pounced on the enemy. This is the art that was a wave attack that tests the reaction. If someone tried to defeat a shadow like before, another shadow would attack at the same instant and ordinary people usually lost. But if it was an expert, it would be able to run forward. A smile appeared on the Ton's face, because he had no doubt that the hero could do it and dodge the attacks. But still, he was confident that he could cut the hero on his own. But the moment he struck, he noticed that the wooden sword of the Sunsui had disappeared. Ton didn't even notice the fact that he had lost his sword. Sunsui put his own blade to Thon's throat. Everyone froze in surprised anticipation, and Dewey decided that this was the end. Brow agreed that it looked like that was the case. Town froze in place and the hero announced that this match was over. The guy was ecstatic that he couldn't even tire out the hero, and it was unequivocally his loss. Dewey praised Sunsui for a job well done. Palette was also ecstatic and exclaimed that it was a great match. Brow noticed that by the time Sunsui was attacked, he had already dropped his sword. This meant that he had fully calculated all of his actions. Ton recognized that he had indeed underestimated the enemy. Regardless of what methods he would have used, he was sure that summoning the shadow could defeat the Sunsui. The hero replied that his secret skill was excellent, but he was just able to read his swordsmanship. When the Ton summoned a bunch of shadows, the hero knew he would do one of two things. One would distract him, and the other would stab him in the back or stagger his defenses with his attack to cause an opening. Town approached Ms. Palette and thanked her for granting him his wish. In that case, the girl hoped he would agree to appear at the trial. The lad gladly agreed, for it was now his turn to answer her wishes. On this occasion, the Palette decided to approach Sir Nuri as well. She wanted to know whether he would consent to a trial to settle their dispute. Besides, the girl recalled that earlier he would agree to it, in case Sir Ton would be okay with it. Sir Nuri hesitantly replied that he had pressing problems, but the Palette assured that it would not take long. Besides, they had hired the same family of cursed mages, so it would be over before he noticed it. Nuri squealed that he didn't want to deal with cursed mages, and Dewey found that rather interesting. She decided that all of them, including the Sunsui, should observe it. The girl turned to Brow with Rain and said that the two of them didn't have to come. It was all up to their wishes, but in the end, it might have been too much for Rain. While the Brouhaha with Rain was strolling through the streets of the city, the girl heard extraneous conversations about the foreign swordsman. People heard that he had a duel with a child-faced holy sword. Everyone who didn't see the duel wondered who won. Once people heard that the holy sword with a baby face won, they were interested in what kind of person he was and what his face looked like. One of the girls smiled and said that his face looked rather baby-faced, but he wasn't cute or cool, but rather plain. Rain was curious about the Brouhaha's opinion whether their mistress would really marry this man. The girl replied that it all depended on their mistress, but there was still the possibility. Rain thought that this man was pretty cool. After all, their mistress had given him the maximum grade. It seemed to the girl that Brow's aunt also had a crush on him, and Brow blushed at such a question. The girl didn't understand why Rain thought that. Rain replied that Brow could not marry her father, and that was indeed true. It seemed to Brow that this was a rather very important subject to Rain. Brow revealed that ever since she was a child, she had always accompanied mistress. That's why she didn't know if this feeling was love. Nevertheless, there was no one who wanted to marry Brow. Rain wanted to make sure that the Brouhaha would tell her father and Mrs. Dewey about this feeling. The girl smiled and replied to Rain that she was right. The girls headed to the Caputo mansion, where they decided to wait for Dewey and Sunsui to return. Rain hoped they would be back soon, and Bra thought so too. With a smile, Brow was already visualizing the way she was talking to Sunsui, and for sure he would be nervous before their conversation. The doors to the room opened and Rain thought they were back. Dewey was simply delighted and said that facing the curse of the sorcery used in the trials was most impressive. But apparently the hero didn't agree with her, and Rain decided to make sure her father was okay. Despite the fact that the Sunsui didn't look well, he replied that he was fine. It seemed to Brow that now was not the best time for them to talk. Palette told the guys that they were using a sorcery curse that turned the person telling lies into stone. Because of this, they were finally able to find out the whole truth. Apparently, this Nure man was plotting to rape some girl. Town wanted to stop her, and thus the Nure got into an argument with him. Brow was not surprised, and for some reason thought of something similar. Their argument turned ugly, and Ton ended up pointing his sword at him. As Dewey watched Nures accuse him, he was accusing himself, and the look on Nure's face was just priceless. In order to protect the people living in Caputo territory, they used the veil to find out the true testimony. Palada had to apologize to the Ton and bowed to him. But the lad believed that he himself had caused trouble in their lands. He gave childish reasons, refusing to explain himself, so he was also at fault. Town smiled and told Miss Pallet that he was the one who owed them an apology. Besides, being exposed to the curse of witchcraft was a valuable experience. And the best part was seeing the way this parasite admitted his guilt, so they had nothing to worry about. Everyone was thrilled with the way this guy was treating this whole situation. Despite that, he didn't look like he was cool, which made Dewey even more amazed. Above all, he witnessed a baby-faced holy sword and Ton admit that he fell in love with his skill. Suddenly, Ton bowed to the hero, begging to be accepted as his apprentice. Sunsui was uncomfortable, for he hadn't even shown that he could teach him. But for whatever reason, this guy thought he could do it. Dewey was delighted and said that in that case he could come to her mansion. The guy introduced himself by his full name, Tun Majin, and said he would look forward to guiding them. Pallet apologized and wanted to know if he knew the name Sunai and if it meant anything to the Ton. Ton replied that it was his younger sister's name and asked how they recognized it. At this point, Dewey was horrified that all their names came down to a guy named Sega and Hepina. Town was equally shocked when he found out that his little sister turned out to be engaged. He got up from the table and said that this was totally unacceptable, and he needed to confirm it immediately. But even if the Palada didn't know it, for her to subject a prince of a foreign country to the curse of witchcraft was unacceptable. There was no way she could send him away without a formal apology. But Thon refused and said he needed to determine what had happened as quickly as possible. He asked the Pallet to understand him. Dewey was also a little concerned about this and decided he could go with them. This was to be in Sir Town's best interests, and the Pallet said she was really sorry about it. Town was grateful to the girl for their attention. Thus the girls learned that Mr. Town was a prince and there was obviously no problem with the pedigree for the Deweys. But it was a real blow to Dewey, for to become related to Happen was an indescribable feeling. Sunsui was also surprised at how this girl looked down on Happen. Palada saw the carriage off with the protagonists and suggested that they meet again sometime. At the moment, they were going to meet Sir Town's sister who lives in the mansion. Town couldn't imagine that his sister would cause trouble for the secret kingdom. Dewey couldn't argue with him and said it was all his sister's doing. But according to the Brow and Sunsui, it was actually her fiancé who was most annoying. Also, Ton was incredibly surprised to learn that Sir Sunsui is a real sage. The fellow told him that there were stories about sages in his country. Of course, he could now understand his strength now that he knew that Sunsui was a sage. He would be honored to receive guidance from someone who had tempered his sword for 500 years. But the hero decided that if he continued to fight back, the Dewey would probably get mad at him. He also felt bad about refusing someone who was so strongly assertive and could understand Ton. Town and all the other girls were thrilled when the hero agreed to train him. But just in case, the hero wished they would go and ask his master for permission. But if that's what it was all about, Dewey suggested they take that permission on their own. But the hero explained that until the rain was of age, he was forbidden to return to the forest, and that was the Suiboku's assignment. Dewey thought there was no way around that and decided to meet him on her own in that case. At this point, they were going to the Happine anyway. Ton apologized that they had to go through all this for him, but Dewey smiled and asked him not to think about it. Besides, she was also interested in meeting Sansui Master. However, they had a 500-year-old man who couldn't even ask a question by himself, so Dewey asked Tawny not to worry. Sunsui frowned and thought of Dewey hitting the source spot. The girl also replied to Brow that she was close to marrying that ancient fossil. Brow jumped up from her seat and wanted to just talk about their marriage to Sansui, which had been put on hold. To the surprise of Sansui and everyone else, the girl wanted to consider the proposal again. Dewey decided to make sure Brow was sure about it, but the girl was absolutely sure about it. Dewey told the boy that if they were going to get married, they needed to tell Sir Suiboku, and before they met with him, they had to make sure they discussed it thoroughly with the Brow and came to a decision. Brow gladly agreed with Dewey and hoped that Sunsui was ready for it. But Sunsui only spread his hands and offered to talk about it when back at the mansion. Apparently, Ton was unaware that the sword of the saint was even bigger than he thought. After a while, the protagonists reached the Batrel mansion. Upon meeting his sister and the Happen family, Ton expressed his opinion. His family had brought some disgrace upon Mrs. Happen. After learning that the royalty of his country, including his sister, should keep their lineage, they continued to treat them as nobles and scoundrels. On behalf of the king and their father, Ton decided to apologize for his sister's indecency. Heppen's father asked the lad not to apologize and said that they would continue to treat them with respect. At this point, the boyfriend threw an embittered look at his sister. The brother had no doubt that his sister Sunai must have been running around and doing as she pleased. Of course, it wasn't like him, but he would like to hear her excuses. Besides, she had to be thinking about their mother and father, and the girl bowed her head and said she had no excuses. Ton also addressed a young man named Seiga who was engaged to his sister. He believed that his sister was at fault, but Seiga also shared her guilt. But Seiga promised that he would treat her very seriously. But Ton thought that if they were serious, then they should have checked the information about her beforehand. Seiga lowered his head and told the guy that he was absolutely right. Happana and Dewey almost became related, so Sir Town and Ms. Sunay really were brother and sister. Meanwhile, Happana didn't understand why Dewey was looking at her so strangely. Dewey looked unhappily at Seiga, which was the future head of the House of Batrable. The thing is, they wanted to go and meet with Sir Suiboku, and so they would like to borrow his divine sword. Sunsui's intention was to take a student and study with him, and it would have been wrong not to ask permission to do so. The Happen family was horrified to think of what they meant. Even the holy sword, Sunsui did not have complete mastery of his art, even though he had practiced for 500 years. The guy admitted that in reality, compared to the master, he was still a beginner. The magic sword shone and reincarnated into a human form. He just had a bunch of things he wanted to say to Suiboka. In that case, Seiga decided that he would go along with them, and honestly, he wanted to meet the master Suiboku. Just then, Happana, who wanted to go along with Seiga, joined him. Tana's sister asked in that case to take her too, but Suga already doubted whether that would be a good decision. The hero didn't know if his master would be angry if this large crowd of people came to visit him, but for some reason he thought that Suiboku wouldn't mind. Sunsui couldn't even remember the master being angry at anything or ever. Dewey said that in that case they would go there in the morning. By the way, the hero had already gotten over the fact that he was married to a brouhaha. All the hero had ever done was to practice on his sword and didn't know what he should do about it now. Rain happily told the brow that now she could tell her father's master about their wedding. But for whatever reason, a strange dark aura hovered over the brow. Brow couldn't imagine that Sunsui was going to propose to her, or that she was supposed to be the one to propose to him. It was as if the hero had similar thoughts in his head, and it was as if they were asking for someone to help them and tell them what to do next. After returning to the mansion, Mrs. Dewey left Brow and Sunsui alone. The hero felt uncomfortable that he had to tell Brow about it somehow. But meanwhile, the brow was also shaking with fear and didn't understand why the hero didn't say anything to her. She thought that this was exactly the place where she needed to be brave. Barely Sunsui started to say something as Brow exclaimed that it was okay and she would say it. But suddenly she felt embarrassed that she had interrupted Sunsui. The hero thought about the fact that it had been 500 years since he came to the other world. But this was the first time he had a good relationship with a girl, and decided not to deceive anyone. Brow thought that there was no way she could ask the hero to marry her, because that would be immodest, and she had to think about what the girl would say. Overcoming her fear, Brow hesitantly told the guy that he had to take responsibility. The hero was certainly fine with it, but didn't understand what it was for. Meanwhile, Dewey and Rain were discreetly watching them from the sidelines, and it seemed completely unromantic to Rain. The next morning, however, Brown and Hero decided to tell their decision. After discussing it last night, they decided to get married after all. Hippana's entire family and friends were thrilled. Some were even shocked. Rain noticed that there was something wrong with Aunt Brow, but the girl would not want to talk about it. Dewey told them that if they both discussed it, it was good, and now they were to meet with Sir Suiboku. Their carriage set off into the forest at the edge of the secret kingdom. Upon reaching the right place, the hero stayed with the carriage and asked to give the master his regards, and the Dewey agreed. The child-shaped magic sword was apparently the happiest and walked ahead of everyone else. Seigu was very surprised to hear that Sensui was getting married, and Happana also thought it was great. She smiled and congratulated the brouhaha. The embarrassed brouhaha smiled back and thanked them. Dewey suggested they put that aside, for it was unclear how long they had to go. All they were told was that they could meet Sir Suiboku if they went into the forest. XX suggested that maybe he wouldn't come out, because after all, he had left him behind. Happana was also curious as to why he did so. No one knew that, and yet, as far as the sword could tell, his apprentice didn't need his strength. But suddenly the voice of the Suiboku answered the exeges that this was no reason at all. He just didn't want them to see how pathetic he was becoming. Everyone was shocked and in no way expected to meet the Suiboku that came out from behind the tree at that moment. No one could believe that the young man in front of them was really Suiboku. But Suiboku replied that he had finally become a true sage and his appearance had not changed in any way. Axex's tears flowed and he ran up to his master to hug him. Based on their story, Suiboku realized that his apprentice had become quite amazing over the past 5 years. The master was delighted with the gorgeous girl he had raised as if she were his daughter and had gained a wonderful wife. He also had a splendid mistress whom he serves. He even got a swordsman who asked to be his apprentice. Suiboku decided that he had indeed earned the title of the strongest swordsman he had raised himself. Dewey still couldn't believe that he was much stronger than Sunsui. Suiboku decided to start over and moved everyone to the grave of Mother Rain. Brow and everyone else was shocked that Suiboku used the light step on them. He was able to use it on a large number of people, plus he didn't touch any of them. Suiboku laughed and said that after separating from execs, he went back and practiced quite a bit. He showed the girl the grave of the woman who had protected her and Rain had to pay her respects to her. Rain thanked the master and then approached the grave. She sat down and prayed to the woman, thanking her for her protection. And now that the Suiboku had finished, he offered to continue their topic about the strongest. Seiga thought that he was the most powerful person, but Suiboku said that was wrong. Being the strongest was just a goal. This meant that there were different meanings of strongest for different people. Many people considered Sunsui to be reliable, trustworthy, a source of pride, and an exemplary swordsman of all time. Seiga would like to hear who Suiboku considered the perfect swordsman. Guy replied that they were all familiar with the behavior and character of the Sunsui, and that this was exactly his ideal. If he wanted to attack someone, he would be able to do so. If he wanted to defeat someone, he will be able to defeat him. And if he wanted to kill someone, he can kill them. The hero has the skill to do that. He maintained a wide field of vision and worked hard to get it right. He never stopped thinking and believed in his training. This was the true heart of a swordsman. Suiboku suggested that they should enjoy the competition without taking pleasure, and be diligent without taking offense. They were not to despise weaknesses and remember to give thanks. They were to wish well of their own accord and share their teachings with those who asked them without holding back. This was the true way of the sword. This was the path that Sunsui chose. He possessed this knowledge and could teach it to others, so he was the ideal for a master. Suiboku had no doubt that Seigi also had his own ideal of the strongest, and the boy exclaimed that it was indeed true. He couldn't understand the heart of the sword, but there were people important to him that he wanted to protect, so he mastered his sword. Seiga said that his way of the sword was to do anything to protect the people important to him. He speculated that he could become stronger if he became a disciple of the Shunsui, and Suiboku was in agreement. He couldn't do it himself, but his apprentice could. Suiboku thought that Sunsui was capable of teaching Seiga the art of the sword. The older brother put his hand on his sister's shoulder and told her that Seiga was actually a good man. Suiboku looked at the girl at the grave, which reminded him of something. He told the guys that a group of people who were looking for Rieni had stopped here recently. Seiga hoped he hadn't told them anything, but Suiboku admitted that he had nothing to hide. Hapina thought it would be helpful to know where they came from, but Dewey doubted that they would have been very kind if Suiboku had not told them anything. These men were looking for a child who had gone missing 5 years ago, and that might have been too much even for the Rain. But Bruh for some reason felt that it didn't apply to her. Something must have happened, and perhaps they were trying to use her for some purpose. There had been some change in the last 5 years. Dewey thought it might have had something to do with the Domino Empire, and it was quite unpleasant. The first princess of Arcana decided to make sure the Palates had sent her army to the eastern border of Caputo territory. The girl confirmed this and said that they had demanded that Sir Nure and any other nobles who sought refuge from them be turned over to them. But this was nothing more than a demand. After suffering at the hands of the previous empire, they were most likely planning to invade their kingdom to replenish their wealth and supplies. And since the Palada knew this, Arcana didn't understand why she didn't turn to the nobles or the royal family for help. The new Domino Empire had 4 of the 8 divine treasures. One of the treasures was an ungake, which had the ability to duplicate any object. Because of this, tens of thousands of soldiers in the new empire's army are equipped with the best equipment that exists. The House of Caputo could not stand against them alone, and it was hopeless. Pallet replied that indeed it might seem so now, and normally they might have thought so as well. Nevertheless, they already knew about the wars, which is quite unusual. People loved Sir Seiga, who would be the head of the house for the next battles and the strongest swordsman in the kingdom named Sansui. Arcana gritted her teeth in anger when she heard about the lightning blade. She said that their pride and joy of the royal family, their elite royal guard, whom Lightning Blade had destroyed single-handedly. He dealt with them without a single wound, and without killing a single person. House Sore retained Sir Shirokuro Sansui, the strongest swordsman who had lived for over 500 years. Also, the House of Caputo kept the strongest sorcerer they could boast of. He had 1,000 times more magical power than even their elite sorcerers. He was capable of utilizing every element of magic. Not to mention the army, he was capable of wiping all countries into powder. A destitute simpleton named Kyubai Suju was their trump card. At this time, an exclusive sorcerer named Kyubai Suju stretched his arms and said it was his turn to give his all. The head of the Caputo house apologized to the guy and asked to extinguish the lives of countless people. The sorcerer asked not to worry, for he would work very hard, and that was why he was so strong. The soldiers doubted that everything would be fine. Besides, the Kyubai could strike the whole city, and if he made a mistake, it would be very bad. Kyubai understood not very complicated things, but to protect the Caputo he was ready to do everything in his power. The army smiled at the boy, and the head of the Caputo told Kyubai that they believed in him. And as the head of the Caputo, the man gave everyone an order. He ordered the trump of the House of Caputo, named Kyubai, to kill all the invaders. The sorcerer put his hands up and told his enemies that they deserved it. A fireball began to form above his head and turned into a huge flame. Meanwhile, the enemy army was only thinking about how to get to the Caputo soon. They were already anxious to capture them, when suddenly one of the knights noticed something wrong ahead of them. The knights were confused when they noticed a huge flaming ball of fire flying towards them. This fireball flew straight at them and the knights began to run with all their legs. But before anyone could move, all that was left of the whole army was charred armor and swords. The Kyubai himself was shocked that only one fireball was enough for them. Meanwhile, Mr. Nuri watched the aftermath of the explosion in his office, and had no doubt that this power of the sorcerer the Caputo had been hiding. He thought that if they had such a sorcerer, the return of the Domino Empire would be a piece of cake. At that moment, two unknown people wearing cloaks entered Master Nure's office and said that they had finally found her. Master Nure marveled that these people could actually find the last surviving member of the imperial family. While the protagonist was waiting for his company at the carriage, soldiers moved in his direction. It turned out to be Dewey's father and her older brother. They apologized for surprising the lad, but they had urgent business to attend to. They came as fast as they could when they heard they were headed this way. The older brother already had his sword at the ready, asking to be shown the guy who got close to his sister. But his father tried to remind him that this was not what they had come here to talk about. The older brother calmed down and left his sword alone, saying that their father was right. The older brother assumed that the Dewey group had already entered the forest, and the Sunsui felt the energy of their entire group. He confirmed this and said that they were now meeting his teacher Suoboku. Dewey's older brother replied that they really needed to talk to them as soon as possible and it would be convenient if they came back right now. But as it happened, they did indeed come out of the forest soon. The whole group was surprised to see their father and brother's army in front of them. Dewey wanted to ask her relatives what reason they had for coming here. Her older brother immediately threw a contemptuous glance at the Ton. The prince assumed that the person in front of him must be Madame Dewey's esteemed brother. He also introduced himself as Thon, who was Suna's elder brother. Brother Dewey grabbed his sword and went to attack, but Sunsui struck him on the head with his sword. Afterward, Dewey's father told the boys that as soon as they had all gone into the forest, they were contacted by the Caputo house. A new army of Domian came to invade, but they were driven back by one sorcerer. Sega thought that this might have been the end of it, but apparently that was not the case at all. Knowing that their caput had such a sorcerer at his disposal, the kingdom that didn't have a powerful army seemed to be coming up with reckless ideas. At this moment, events were unfolding to overthrow the new regime that had just taken over the dominoes through revolution. The kingdom could have tried to hire this sorcerer, and the Sunsui is bargaining chips to prevent the war from starting. The elder brother along with his sister only exhaled heavily. Ever since Sunsui had destroyed the royal guard, that day big brother Dewey became the head. The royal family has a grudge against the Sunsui, and they really let such trifles color their judgment. The Hepina group thought that something like this had really happened. From here they immediately headed for the Caputo territory, and Father Dewey would like them to go with them. Dewey believed that if that was the way things were, there was nothing that could be done here. She suggested that they postpone the discussion of the Sunsui student until later and also go to the Caputo territory. Dewey's father looked at Sunsui and Tung and said that this was a foreign matter to the two of them and he did not want to impose on them. But Suna exclaimed that the people of Majin did not run away from the battle. Town also thought that he had caused Miss Palette a lot of trouble, and if he could be of use to her, he did not intend to refuse the request for cooperation. Sunsui thought that Master Thon would still continue traveling with them. As for Miss Dewey, in order for her to betroth him, she would probably try to create a circumstance that he would not be able to refuse. But if she tried to force a marriage without publicizing his consent, the hero did not think either of them would be very happy. The hero wanted to say something to Master Toon about something and approached him. Sunsui hoped that the guy didn't mind if he started to continue traveling with his mistress. Ton laughed loudly and said that even he wasn't that ignorant in this world, and for such a haughty woman to show interest in him as a man, he could not have asked for more boasting. Though he might have been a prince of the Majin Kingdom, he was not in line to succeed to the throne. Town thought that if Mrs. Dewey agreed to accept him, dedicating his life to this kingdom didn't sound so bad to him. Everyone's mouths dropped open in amazement that he was indeed the very real prince. As for the heads of the great noble houses, they had their respective trump cards, or rather their heroes, and it all ended in a place in Caputo territory. The Kyuubi sorcerer sat pensively on the edge of the precipice from his fireball. At this moment the head of the Caputo and 2 soldiers accompanying him approached him. Palette called out to her uncle, who turned to the girl. She thought that Saikyou had been sitting in the same place all this time. Apparently he was not entirely indifferent to it, and Palette was worried about it. As the ones giving him orders, they had to be able to support him. Palette was in agreement with him and replied that it was their responsibility. Palette approached the guy, who was happy to see her. She expressed her sincere gratitude for his help, but for a moment the Kyuubi hesitated. He didn't think there was anything to actually thank him for, but the Palater replied that there was nothing more that could be done, and if he hadn't used his magic, there would have been many more victims. Kyuubi was clearly disturbed by this, and he pondered over whether there really was no other option. He hoped that now the war would be over and asked the Palette about it. The girl had to say no, but they wanted to make it an end. After all, it was their duty and their responsibility. As the Dewey carriage moved on, the girl sighed heavily. Looking out the window, she thought frustratedly about Sir Tun riding in the other carriage. Her older brother replied that Tun stayed with his sister Sunai, and that was the most obvious way to travel. As the hero had realized earlier, there were people looking for rain near the master's house. They thought that the most suspicious parties were the Domino nobles taking refuge in the harness. However, it appeared that Sir Suiboku did not identify their origins. Rieni was worried that everything would be alright and questioned her father. But Sunsui thought everything would be fine and she had nothing to worry about. Dewey's older brother replied that he was right and it didn't matter who they were or where they were from. Sansui and Brow were charged with protecting his sister, and if they had to put their lives on the line to guarantee it, they would. And as the head of the House of Isekai'd, which rules the territory of Isekai'd, he was charged with the protection of all the people living in it. And if it was all for them, he would gladly risk his own life. As far as Big Brother Dewey could tell, Riena was one of his people. Therefore, there was absolutely nothing for which she could be concerned. Rain told Mr. Head that it was pretty cool. But as members of the Isekai'd house, they were just doing what was expected of them. The older brother looked at his smug sister, who was in complete agreement with him. Dewey replied that whether it be the losing nobles or the new Domino government or the Arcana family, they wouldn't let anyone touch a single hair on the Rain's head. Brow hoped she wasn't faking it, but the hero noticed that Dewey was no different from her usual self. Meanwhile, an interesting conversation was also taking place in the carriage of Sega's group. Sega decided to find out from Toon if he was really going to marry Miss Dewey. He wanted to warn him that Isekai'd could really kill him, and his sister asked her older brother to think about it again, for it was too risky. Ton replied that before he became the head of a noble house, he was just a brother. For someone whose younger sister was attracting so much attention, his actions were perfectly natural. The previous head was very attached to Dewey, and they would both try to kill him, and Town already knew this for sure. Thon thought it was natural for his father to do this, and once Sir Sega decided to introduce himself to their father, he would also need to prepare for the same reception. Sega suddenly felt uncomfortable. Instead of leaving him as his guard, the Ton liked that the elder Dewey brother was willing to go out and bloody his hands. It suited Mr. Sunsui Sir very well, and he is much stronger than the Domino nobles. However, his sister didn't think that this head would ever really accept him. But it was worth it just to look at who was guarding his beloved sister. It was a foreigner Sunsui and a girl named Brow, and as long as their fighting skills were excellent, he would not reject either of them. Although it was indeed a fascinating topic, but father would prefer them to focus on the new dominoes and Sega agreed with him. In order to prevent the royal family from further escalating this war, the 4 great noble houses had to join forces. Seiga was already thinking about it, but he also wondered why they were trying so hard to stop this war. It wasn't that he wanted a war, but the new dominoes were the ones who invaded them. And if the Arkan royal family wanted to respond in kind, he didn't find that terribly unreasonable. Now, the new Dominiano are very poor, but they have a lot of land. It just wouldn't be worth it if the Arkan royal family tried to take it. Seiga thought it was worth it, and he was right. If the only goal was to destroy all of their troops, then this sorcerer would be enough. However, in order to occupy all of this land, they would need a significant number of soldiers and the supplies needed to support those soldiers. There would also need to come from the Kingdom of Arkan. It would be foolish to ignore their national interests just to raise the status of the Arcana royal family. Seiga understood exactly what Heppana's father meant. It wouldn't be them who would suffer the most. It would be the soldiers on the front lines and the citizens who would suffer from the additional war taxes. It was for them all, and they had to keep this war in check. These were the duties of the head of the family, and the Seiga, as the future leader, had to see the big picture too. In the Arcana realm, the country was established 300 years ago. Leaving aside those who had very long lives, the magic sword exacts had existed for a very long time. In this country, there are 4 great noble houses that held as much power as the royal family. They supported the royal family with military might, even before the kingdom was founded. Prominent families of warriors. They were the Isekai'ds and the Batrables, a family that took supporters every generation. The compassionate assimilated healers of the Caputo, and those who contributed immensely to the royal family when the kingdom was formed. The cursed family of Diskia traders. Each generation, the royal family gave territories of equal size to each family. With this land, they also granted a large amount of authority. This sounded pretty good, but only on paper. It meant that out of the 5 territories of the kingdom, the royal family only ruled over one of them. In times of crisis, the 5 families might band together to overcome it, but then the king was unable to rule at will. Besides, the power was far from absolute. The Isekai'd family made a clear move against the royal family by losing Sunsui in the elite royal guard. This country had 4 heroic figures, the so-called trumps. In addition, there were also 2 of the 8 divine treasures. But the royal family didn't exactly have direct access to them. Just as the 4 noble houses were concerned about the recklessness of the royal family, the royal family was also afraid of the growing power of the noble houses. The royal family wanted a trump card for their own use, and it was an extremely sympathetic desire. At the Caputo mansion, the first princess asked her father how their affairs were. She said that they couldn't even lay a finger on the Fushiakyu. The Harness King replied to her that this was the man who was currently heading the new government. He was the only one who had successfully overthrown the Domino Empire. This included the fact that he possessed divine treasures. He was not inferior to the other houses and their heroes. Now the problem was how to get one for the royal family. It was for this reason that they had to use this war to do it. The kingdom had an overwhelming advantage, and most of their demands were accepted without opposition. However, asking the leader to give up their divine treasure seemed like a futile endeavor. But anyway, the Arcana suggested that they attack them and create an excuse. Then they would take on their rivals, and indeed, it would give them more leverage. However, it was not in their national interest to continue the war, and they would never get approval from the 4 houses. In that case, the princess suggested that they could turn in more deserting nobles. Also, they could offer them their food aid. Their invasion of the Caputo is what led in the first place. However, it would have been hard for them to justify offering aid to people who had just invaded them. They could have tried surrendering to the Arkan royal family. The princess thought about the consequences and what else they could have done. At that moment, someone knocked on their office. After the knight was allowed to enter the study, he apologized for the intrusion. He reported that a nobleman of Domino named Nure was here to see them, and he wanted to meet their magic at any cost. The Harness King thought it was a deserting nobleman, and the girl wondered why they didn't chase him away at the gate. The fact was, he insisted, and it had to do with the daughter of the Holy Sword. Hearing about the daughter of the Lightning Blade, the first princess asked to let him in. Nure bowed, greeting His Majesty and Her Highness. He was honored to have the opportunity to meet them in person. The girl thought they might have missed the introduction and asked him to tell them about the Lightning Blade. What interested her most was the information about Shirokuro Sunsui's daughter. Nure smirked and admitted that he had that information. At the moment, rebels were rampant throughout the Domino Empire. They were now calling themselves the new government. The emperor and those associated with him had all been captured and imprisoned. 6 years ago, their great former emperor had passed away. In the ensuing struggle for the succession, many members of the imperial family were killed. The child with the emperor's blood and her nurse were missing and their whereabouts were unknown. To protect the child from being used by the rebels, they searched tirelessly for her, and the Nure men found traces of the nurse. In one forest they met a boy dressed in clothes similar to those of the Sunsui. The harness princess had no doubt that this was a lightning blade master named Suiboku. The boy told them that the woman had died and been buried, and the child had been entrusted to an apprentice. There was no doubt that he was referring to Sunsui and his daughter, and the proof of this was there. The fact was that the girl's hair was similar to that of the previous emperor, and it was colored a beautiful silver. Based on all of this, the daughter of Lightning Blade was the surviving member of the imperial family of Domino. Nure believed that this must be the conduction of heaven, and if they rallied with her, the sorcerer Caputo would fry all those rebels and revive the Domino Empire. Therefore Nure wished they would give them their help. The king asked to enlighten them on how they could benefit from all this. The Dominoes and the Arcana had deep ties for many generations, but the Nure pleaded with them. The princess suggested that they simply use any girl they wanted as their mascot. In any case, she would want proof that she was indeed the emperor's daughter. At some point, a thought popped into her head. She decided to check with her father to see if the Daneslave was really in the Aku's disposition. As their Nure realized, they were talking about some sort of divine treasure. The king told the nobleman that he would arrange a meeting with the heads of all 4 noble houses and ask him to tell his story again in front of everyone. The Isekai'd house had the main character as a trump card. The Betrel house had a Seiga at the same time. The house of Caputo had the one they called the strongest sorcerer. The house of Diskia apparently also has someone, and so on. Thus the 4 noble houses and their trumps before meeting the king of the Arcanum decided to gather and renew their bonds. The trumps of Caputo and Diskia are obviously from Japan as well. The protagonist immediately wondered how many Japanese the god had sent here by his mistake. He also assumed that God was going to send them some more. When the heroes arrived at the Caputo mansion, they were ushered into the office of the head of the Caputo house. The head greeted the heroes and thanked them for coming to see them. Older brother Dewey said that their kingdom was facing a crisis, and so they were obliged to come. Besides, they were the ones who had to thank them for sending them the summons. Heppina's father said that he was right and that when the houses were already packed, they would do their best to save the kingdom. The head of the house Caputo replied that they could indeed be relied upon, as suddenly Cubai and Paletta came out behind the head. He was delighted to see them and shook hands with the Seiga and asked how they were doing. The noisy fellow introduced himself as Suju. Kyubi was also excited that he might have mistaken him for a Sunsui, but the Seiga replied that it was a pleasure to meet him. He had already noticed that this sorcerer was too hyperactive. Heppina and Dewey went into a stupor, not knowing how to react to this guy. After greeting Seigi, Xiaoju approached Sunsui for introductions. He assumed that the hero was already here in Caputo, and he was very sad that he couldn't meet the strongest swordsman. The guy actively shook Sunsui's hand and expressed his joy that he was finally able to meet him. Dewey decided to ask the palette who it was, and the girl replied that it was the main trump card of their house. Dewey had certainly heard of him, but he didn't look like the same sorcerer who was responsible for that massacre of tens of thousands of soldiers. He made a good impression on the boys. Sunsui thought the Caputo's home was quite warm and friendly, and Seiga thought they all seemed very nice. Suddenly, an elderly man accompanied by 2 people walked into their room. He was quite curious about what was going on here. The head of Diskia's house noticed that it was quite lively. Accompanying him was a girl named Pandora and a young boy named Yuki Shun. Big brother Dewey was glad that Sir Diskia was healthy. It was like having 100 other people, and everyone was glad to see them here. The head of the Caputo shook hands with the head of the Diskia and admitted that he was ashamed to make him come all the way here for such a matter. But the old man replied that there was no use in praising the old men when they had done nothing. Sunsui turned his attention to the young fellow behind the head. The hero sensed nothing from him, but there was a very ominous aura coming from the other woman. Suddenly, the Seiga's magic sword glowed and reincarnated into a human form. He ran up to the woman and told Pandora that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Pandora smiled and immediately recognized her familiar Ixays. Seiga was surprised that he knew her, but the sword replied that she was just like him, one of the divine treasures. She was the cursed armor of calamity called Pandora. Pandora assumed that Seiga was now the new master of the exegesis. For whatever reason, it made her laugh. Pandora couldn't believe that his past master monster had thrown him away, even though Ixaz bragged about it. It made her feel creepily funny and Exasa's blushed. The girl was madly enjoying it and her gaze shifted to that monster's supposed apprentice. Shunsui said that if she meant Suiboku, that was correct and he was its master. Pandora abruptly changed her facial expression to a sinister one and ordered the guy to die in the fire, causing the hero to go into a stupor. Pandora thought it was like the worst nightmare ever and this monster shouldn't be breeding. Just one was already bad enough, and it was outrageous to have more of them. Pandora felt that they had to be destroyed and with a quick step she headed towards her partner Shun. She felt that there was no need to worry about what would happen next and offered to just kill them all right now. But Shun asked her not to be so ridiculous. Pandora didn't like his answer and said that if he wasn't doing what he wanted to do, she didn't understand why he was even born. To her, it was like a YOLO. He put his heart into every single thing and then just regretted it wholeheartedly. Shun frowned and warned that she really needed to shut up. With indignation, Pandora puffed her cheeks at him and the hero decided to find out Exasa what had happened between them. It seemed to him that his master might have done something to her. The thing is, about 2,000 years ago, a Suiboku had used it to shatter her and kill her owner. That had upset the Pandora quite a bit, and that explained why it was like that. Shunsui thought it was a pretty intense story. At some point, the head of the Deskia house noticed that his granddaughter had disappeared somewhere. At that moment, the doors opened abruptly and the girl greeted everyone present. She introduced herself as a krill and said that she was the next head of the Deskia house. Everyone in the room froze at the unexpected sight before them and an awkward pause came over them. Shun promptly ran up to the girl and asked what was the reason she was completely naked. The girl smiled and said that she had secretly lent him her coat, and she thought it would show everyone what good friends they were. Dewey noticed that Acrylic was the same as she always was. Hapuna gave Seigaku a disgruntled look and told him that as a future leader, he would have to figure out how to work with her. Paletta could also agree that she hadn't changed at all since they were little. The head Caputo saw that the head of the Deskia had quite a lot on his mind. The old man admitted that it was sad when he had no one but her, and that's a pretty sad thing. Older brother Dewey noticed that she at least came when she was called, and that's something. The sorcerer named Kyubai was very glad that he wasn't taken away by the house of Deskia. Seiga and Shunsui noticed that indeed truer words, no one had ever spoken here before. Soon the heads of the 4 great noble houses and the king gathered here to discuss how to deal with the new domino government. The first question concerned the recent battle and the house of Caputo performed magnificently. The king of the Arcana asked to accept his thanks for it and the head of the Caputo bowed, saying that the king was honoring him. They had an army equipped with weapons and mass-produced armor with treasures, and they did well in repelling them. The head of the Caputo replied to the king that as guardians of the eastern lands of the Arcana, they were only doing their assigned duty. But in the back of his mind, the head was still worried about the Kyubai. The head of the Deskia respectfully asked the king for permission to express his opinion regarding the conflict provoked by the new domino government. As a great nation, they thought it was prudent to seek peace. In other words, the head of the Deskia wanted them to be merciful to the country that had invaded them. They had wiped out quite a few of their troops and the new government must not have many soldiers left. In that case, even if they reconciled, they would have little disagreement. The threatened territory belonged to the Caputo and those who were pushing them back were also Caputo. Hapine's father felt that they had to respect their wishes. The invading army was completely destroyed, and there would be no stain on the honor of their kingdom. In truth, the king had a certain topic to discuss with them all and asked someone to come into the cabinet. The man who entered the room apologized for his intrusion. It was a domino nobleman who had come here to seek refuge. Dewey's elder brother and father completely didn't understand what the domino noble was doing here. The nobleman bowed and said that he was humbly presenting himself before the esteemed council of the Arcana, and he was honored to speak here. In the course of his private investigations, he had come across some very startling information. It concerned the holy sword of Shunsui, and also one that is well known as his daughter, a girl named Rain. The fact was that she was the heiress of the imperial family, their domino empire. Everyone present was clearly surprised by his words. With the power of the sorcerer of the house of Caputo, they could destroy those rebels who called themselves the new domino government, and thus proclaiming Her Highness Rain as the new empress, and thus they could restore the domino empire. The nobleman felt that they should lend them their assistance in this endeavor, but his older brother Dewey only called him a lousy domino mongrel. His head got pretty big after being summoned by His Majesty. The elder brother could not allow that he was using his servant's child for his own gain. He decided that the best place for such a brazen head could only be on the floor. The head of the Deskia decided that the Sapeid's head could wait a bit, and it would just stain their expensive carpets with dirt. Besides, he couldn't believe that His Majesty had just swallowed this stupid story, and was going to help this nobleman in his cause. This pea-brain didn't save a dime, but he expected them to take out their purses. This nobleman wanted to use their kingdom's money to save another country, and that would be a betrayal to their taxpayers. The king admitted that of course that was not his intention at all, but asked everyone present to think about it for a moment. The leader of the new government, Isekai'd, imprisoned all members of the imperial domino family, and one of the 8 divine treasures in his possession is the demonic blade Daneslave, which had a rather annoying ability. He could find any person who shared blood with the person he was born of. That was why, if Lightning Blade's daughter was indeed related to the previous emperor of the Domino Empire, he wouldn't let her walk around free. Elder brother Dewey said that the burden of the whole country could have fallen on Rain, and the king agreed with him. Therefore, simply making peace might not have done them enough good. Their kingdom and the new domino government might have to establish friendly relations to avoid future problems. The domino nobleman didn't understand what the king was talking about and didn't expect him to say such words. The king told the embittered nobleman that he could go now, for he had already done enough. Nuri flew furiously out of the study and slammed the doors with all his might. After that, the king wanted to talk about the divine treasures that have a total of 4 houses. It was an ungake that was capable of making copies of any man-made object. A Vajra that gave its owner complete control over the weather. A Daneslave that drank the blood of any person it cut, or perhaps other people who shared its blood. An elixir that could alter fate itself so that its possessor would escape death. For an enemy nation, the most feared are the ungake and the Vajra. But in this case the elixir and Daneslave give them more trouble. And as long as they have Daneslave at their disposal, they can always find Rain wherever it runs. Moreover, with the elixir in their hands, they have no way to kill them, even for someone who possessed a power as overwhelming as a lightning blade. If this is true, and Riani is indeed the emperor's rightful heir, then she will have to spend her entire life on the run because of this fact. But Big Brother Dewey has already given his word to Sunsui and Riani that he will take care of them. And if there's any chance that Rain might be targeted, then they can't leave them alone. They would need to negotiate with the Aklu, but then their kingdom might lose their strongest swordsman. But they didn't know if sending help would work as an excuse to talk. It might have suited them, but not their men. It was for this reason that the Harness King called this meeting. They had to work together to preserve the welfare of the kingdom. While the king and the heads of the 4 noble houses discussed how to deal with the new domino government, Sunsui and all the others gathered in front of Suju's house. Suju was delighted to see so many people and exclaimed that it was great. Suga could only say that because she is a cursed sorcerer, but she didn't understand why Paletta and Kyubi were both under the curse. But as she could guess, his magic just activated on its own. He had even blown up his house many times already. That meant that his magic activated unconsciously and could destroy buildings. It was hard for Tsuji to imagine that. Paletta answered them that to prevent his magic from accidentally exploding, they used this curse. They were his guardians and without Caputo Suju's approval, he could not use magic. Thus, he would use his talent. As for the reason why he was living here, the guy was glad that he hadn't destroyed his home yet. But living in the center of the city was scary, both for him and everyone else. It might have been a little inconvenient, but it was still his home. Dewey thought that. At any rate, Seiga had really done it and become a disciple of Sunsui. Hepina assumed that there was no problem with that, but it was a little off. Dewey smiled and said that it was just that the future leader of the Betrel was studying under the supervision of her bodyguard, which infuriated Hepina. But the girl thought that if this Seiga, he would surpass his teacher in no time. Brow and Rain thought about that. It is really disappointing. Rain already knew about everything, and she was told that there was a strong possibility that she was a descendant of the Domino Emperor. She was really worried about that, yet she was still able to act the way she always had. It was because everyone around them treated her well, and she didn't worry about it. They had really good comrades, and the hero suggested that they get down to business. At the moment, he had 2 apprentices that he was going to teach the sword skills he had learned from the Suiboku master. Ton and Seiga thanked Sunsui for his instruction. Meanwhile, Pandora was angrily squinting at the guys. She was super annoyed with the way this guy was passing on his monster's teachings. Sunsui was embarrassed, and he realized that it really hurt one of the master's victims. But Shun felt that all he had done was trash her, and it wasn't worth holding a grudge against him. Pandora didn't understand what the hell he thought she was and said that of course it didn't bother her. Acrylic also wondered why Pandora hated this Suiboku so much. The thing is, he had no weaknesses at all. He was absolutely flawless and completely invincible, as if he was stronger than all of humanity. And on top of that, he was also immortal. Pandora had nothing to say to him except to wish him dead. She thought that Shun understood her, but instead he suggested that she should also die. Akryl was enamored with Shun and thought he was pretty cool. She couldn't get enough of the disgust on his face and the way he treated girls like dirt. It pissed Shun off even more, and he wished the same for her as he wished for Pandora. Meanwhile, the hero decided to check with Saikyou to see if he had actually trained in kendo. The guy replied that he didn't have the skill, so he thought it would be best if they wanted to learn sword fighting, they couldn't just aim for the head, body, arms, and legs. There are many good things in real combat, and Ton could agree with that. Saikyou doubted that it was okay to slash people in the legs, but if it wasn't, then there was no reason for him to learn it. The hero didn't think that he would always create leg armor with support magic. It was frowned upon in the competition, but in real combat it's an important option. And to be fair, much of the Saigyou's power goes unused. Dewey thought he was talking about Saigyou being an idiot. Fencing had a lot of freedom, and it would be best not to rely on any preconceptions they had about sword fighting. Dewey thought it was because he was so simple. His thought process was also uninspiring. Hepina was angry with Dewey and asked her to stop it. Sunsui assured her that everything was perfectly fine, because after all, everyone started out as an amateur. Even though Saigyou was a complete amateur, he still bragged about getting into fights. Dewey's words were increasingly infuriating to Hepina. Saigyou also hung his head, and Ton laughed. He noticed that Ms. Dewey didn't spare words, and that was fine for him. Hepina didn't understand why Sunsui was letting her talk like that, but Dewey thought it was all because she had not in the slightest degree said anything wrong. Saigyou got down on his knees and said that he had already made up his mind on that he would do his best. Ton noticed that it was well said and praised his fighting spirit. Hepina smiled and thought that it would be very difficult for him, but he couldn't give up. In that case, Sunsui motioned for them to start as he suddenly heard someone's footsteps behind him and turned around. The guy remembered the Arcana Kingdom and the new Domino government. They had the matter of the birth of the rain, and the tangled affairs had not yet turned into chaos. One by one, what Sunsui needed to do was to become clear. A Domino nobleman approached him and greeted the hero. Nurei told the baby-faced holy sword that a considerable amount of time had passed. The hero also thought that despite everything else, he should have fought. At night in the territory of the new Domino government, a light was burning in the mansion. The dark-haired guy that sat on the couch in front of the chessboard was contemplating his next move. He thought of a sorcerer who could easily defeat their forces. With these thoughts, the man shifted the king on the chessboard. He had no idea that someone like this sorcerer lived in the harness. The chess moved again, and the guy said they just wanted to play, but it was a pretty unfair game. The guy got up from the couch, marveling that someone so rude could interfere with their plans. The objects that lay with him on the couch glowed brightly. The loss was still a loss, but the dark-haired boy believed that it was not the end. There was no way he was going to give up, and he wanted to fight until his last breath, or until the blood of the emperor who had not yet been completely pushed out of existence. The objects that glowed took on the appearance of human beings and stood behind the guy. A nobleman named Nuri apologized to the lad and said that not much time had passed since their last encounter with the holy sword with the face of a baby. He also noticed that quite a few important people had gathered here. The king and heads of families had their backs turned to him. But Nurei thought that if it was about these children with a little bit of flattery, they could be easily persuaded. And for someone with his talent, the nobleman thought it was like taking candy from a baby. Sunsui inquired for what purpose Nurei had come to them. Perhaps they had already been informed about it. Nurei reminded them that Mrs. Rain was the Empress of Dominoes, and he had come here to ask for alms, for Mrs. Rain had already done so. The hero answered him that the Rioni was no more, and she had already secured her own place in the house of Isekai'd. Even so, Lady Rioni had the opportunity to become Empress, and they should want to support her in such a prestigious endeavor. Nurei believed that if she became Empress, it would lead her to a truly bright future. It made Dewey smile to think that the Isekai'd's assurances could really be that unreliable. Nurei faltered and said that was absolutely not what he meant. It seemed to him that there was no greater bliss than becoming an empress. Unlike the parliamentary system of the Arcana Kingdom, the Domino Empire was ruled by a single monarch. And for the sake of the Empress, the entire empire would move to do her every bidding. After all, the decisions of the Empress were absolute, and orders had to be obeyed, and disobedience was out of the question. Anyone dissatisfied with imperial rule could be subjected to the harshest punishment. The sorcerer told the Nurei that this was why their country was destroyed. Pallet supported him and said that the Nurei only focused on his greed, and that was sad for the well-being of his people. They could only suffer. The nobleman became furious and wailed that he didn't want to hear anything from the youth who didn't know anything. Hepina also thought that the talk of Rioni becoming empress had already been rejected by His Majesty the King. Nuri tried to explain that he meant exposing those rebels who called themselves the new government, and all those gathered here are the people who are responsible for the future of the Kingdom of Arcana. They were in pursuit of a better future. Seiga agreed that they were all future heads here, and they were now obligated to obey the decisions made by the king and the current leaders. Everyone smiled at Seiga, and Tun praised the boy for his well-spoken words. Krill watched everything from the sidelines, and it seemed to her that the guys were quite retarded. She smiled and said that House Diskia was willing to cooperate with them, which clearly revitalized the noblemen. Well, of course they were willing to do it if they had the money to pay them. Then they would be happy to sell them their armed forces. They would set a fair price and there was no need to make a deal. Everything was just tight and clean. Nure couldn't find words for this little rascal. Meanwhile, the girl turned to the Shun with a smile and asked for his opinion about it. The guy only turned to the sage Sir and the Shun. He clarified with them that they had previously practiced sword fencing or something like that. The Domino nobleman didn't understand at all what this had to do with him. Shun told the guys that they had no need to waste their time talking to that toad. Shun suggested that they just figure something out and send him packing as they saw fit. After all, there was nothing he could do anyway in all likelihood. Nuri lost his temper and said he'd had enough. Every single one of them was brazen enough to talk to him. So Nuri decided that there would be no more games. Krill swooped down on the Shun and squeezed him in her arms, yelling about how awesome he was. She grinned and admitted that he had gone too far with his last part. Shun asked to get behind him, plus he said exactly what he was thinking. And Acrylic thought that was the most wonderful thing about him. She thought all the guys, except for Dewey, were a little hard on him. Dewey grinned and thought they were pretty considerate, and Bruh thought Own complimented them. Sugi had some doubts about whether it was all for the best, but the Acrylic smiled and said it was fine. In fact, it didn't seem completely normal, in Seiga's opinion. Krill replied that their country had already decided to get rid of these leeches, and what followed depended on what that person decided to do next. If he's a complete idiot, even their royal family won't want anything to do with him. The Sword Seigi said that there was no problem here, and they could push the rest aside. What they knew was that there was an elixir among them. Pandora confirmed his words and said that as long as the elixir was with them, everything would be just fine. Seiga noticed that Ton was thinking about something. He decided to ask Sir Thon what was wrong. The boy hesitated, but replied that being a prince, a curious thought had occurred to him. The fact was that this man had destroyed a powerful country and established himself as its new leader, and the Ton was curious as to what kind of man he was. Everyone confirmed his words and decided that they knew absolutely nothing about him. No one could know for sure if he really wanted to kill the rain just because the Emperor's blood flowed in it. Sun Sui clenched his blade tightly and thought about the fact that he was just a simple swordsman, and all he could do was hope that this guy would be someone reasonable. The new town of Domino was quite crowded. The rumor of Domino's defeat was spreading all the time. People were wondering if everything would be alright in their country, because they had heard that many people had died in the war. Besides, they finally got rid of the nobles. The city was in a panic and wondered how the leaders of the new government would act. At that time, the head of the country, Ukyu, gathered his top people in a meeting room. But before they begin, he would like to ask about their recent loss on the battlefield. Guy glanced at the man who literally jumped up on the spot. He was the one who was responsible for the external relations with the Arcana Kingdom. As he had said before, they were facing a sorcerer capable of killing tens of thousands of people in an instant. He had no idea what they could do, but the guy believed that they had a moment. With a groan, the man stood up from his chair and exclaimed that the lad should have remembered that he was vital in the rebellion and his talent was indispensable to the new government. However, Ukyu did not think that such an act with the surviving soldiers sacrificed in this war could really appease them. The man didn't know what to say to the head, and Ukyu replied that he would make him take responsibility for this failure. He would stand before the people and the charges against him would be explained, and the verdict of these people will decide his fate. The man sitting at the table shuddered. He begged Mr. Head to have mercy on him, but if he wanted mercy, it was better to ask the nobles for it. Ukyu gave the order to take him away, and the soldiers seized the man under his arms. As they led him away from the room, the man begged and pleaded for another chance, but Ukyu would not listen to him. After the man was led away, Ukyu startled everyone with a loud clap on the table. He said that this was what he really wanted to talk to everyone about. He didn't understand why after losing only one battle, they now had to make peace with the Arcana Kingdom. His words shocked everyone in the room. He decided to repeat his question and asked why they were just collecting all their divine treasure and going for a polite greeting. After all, they should have done their best to create better conditions and they would resort to asking for forgiveness. Ukyu said that until he returned, they would all have to make plans in that direction. One of the men said they understood him perfectly. Mentally, he was glad that Ukyu would be away for a while. Ukyu warned them that if they did anything strange while he was away, he would take their lives. Of course, failure is natural and inevitable, but if they try to run away without taking responsibility, then all their families will be killed. The head wanted everyone to take responsibility before they died. If they didn't want to die, then they had better do their best to come up with good plans. Akaio hoped that he was being clear, after which he left the office. The guy, along with his treasures, left the study and told them that it was quite hot in there. It seemed to him that he was cheating the internal administration or something like that. He was supposedly running the country, but Akaio felt like he was playing a business simulator. Everything around him was garbage and garbage. One of his treasures asked the master not to be disappointed by this. Akaio said that a bunch of his people had just died and he was beyond disappointed in that. On top of that, now he had to go to the country he had fought himself. Regardless of what the conditions might have been, they were just farmers who were given garbage. The girl thought it was the perfect time to leave things in her own hands and asked Akaio about it. Another of the girls told her that she was like a stick that could move around the clouds and grow a little and thought she was talking real nonsense. The girl only silently approached her, as they knew she was a spearwoman who saw that small tools were just as petty. But the girl smirked and answered her that even the big tool had a smaller caliber with it. The girl that was a spear called her partner a dull knife, but the latter replied to her that her pettiness matched her smallness. The girls seemed to be drilling each other with their gaze, but Akaio asked them to stop fighting. One of the treasures laughed and said that it was well said. That was what made him their master. It was just that these two were thinking wholeheartedly about how they could be of service to the chapter, and the thought of that probably should have made him smile. But it was clearly not the case. Akaio sighed heavily and said that nothing could be further from the truth. The head told the two girls that it would be best if they calmed their passions now. Their master was about to go into enemy territory. Now was the time for them as treasures to put aside their differences and work together. Spear told Knife that she should be grateful for the elixir's intervention, but the girl was about to tell her the same thing. Akaio wished he had helped shut them up much sooner, and Elixir laughed loudly. In his opinion, it was good to give his life for his country, but it wasn't time for their master yet. The other treasure girl agreed with the elixir and said that he had yet to fulfill what he truly desired. Akaio of course was in agreement with them, for he was not going to humbly offer them his head just yet. Besides, they had killed all the people living in the city, and the head decided that they couldn't get away with it. He wanted to remove every drop of the Emperor's blood from this world and vowed to do so even if he was killed. The king, along with the head of the Caputo, waited for the enemy troops to appear on the horizon. The Arcana king believed that once they saw this scar of destruction, he was certain that they would lose all hope of fighting their kingdom. But the head was somehow sure that they would fight them. The king understood what he meant by that. The dignity of the royal family is nothing in the face of conditional interests. If these people intend to bring harm to the kingdom, then there was no need to play a farce. And if they decide they lack integrity, they will ask the king for reparations and go home. But first they must put an end to this war. Meanwhile, the head of the Ukyu, along with his 4 treasures, arrived at the mansion, Caputo, and proceeded to the guest room. As soon as the Ukyu sat down on the sofa, in the same instant all the treasures turned back into weapons. Yuri took a glass in his hands and asked his men if everything was all right. The cloaked man replied that the sorcerer's hut was in the Caputo's residence. The bandits they had hired were on their way. However, there was another point. It looked like Mrs. Rain was also here. They didn't receive orders to secure Mrs. Rain, so they sent some of their elites. Yuri wanted to ask them to try not to injure the girl, and the man accepted his order. The heirs of the 4 noble houses were also there, and Yuri's men wanted to know what to do with them. The Domino nobleman smirked and ordered to kill them. After all, as long as Lady Rain remained alive, they still had free reign. The hooded man understood and withdrew. Yuri thought that if these guys had supported him earlier, he would have spared them. In addition, the rebels had disappeared somewhere, but not only the sorcerers but also the heiresses had to die. If they don't make mistakes, the war will only intensify. And after that, the nobleman believed that Lady Rain would be in his hands. Yuri took a sip of whiskey and thought that naturally he would be appointed to a very respectable position after the war. He thought that these people had made a foolish mistake in deciding to join forces with these rebels. The only thing he was sure of was that the king and the heads of the 4 noble houses would definitely regret it. The nobleman wondered how they would apologize to him after realizing that his suggestion was the right one. And just imagining it in his head, the nobleman began to involuntarily smile. Suddenly, he remembered something and wondered if the heirs of the 4 noble houses brought in their escorts. The hooded man replied that Mrs. Rain's foster father was there along with the owner of the Pandora. In that case, Nuri thought there might be a problem. From what he heard, even if the Pandora owner was in death, he could still kill 100 people. The holy sword is also powerful as the rumors said, but it's only one person and probably wouldn't be able to do much. Their research showed that the sorcerer couldn't use the spell freely and it was just a game. Nirei's orders were to simply overwhelm them in numbers and dispatch all their men. The hooded man bowed to Nirei and said it would be done as he said. The Domino nobleman believed that everything would go exactly as he planned and this war would definitely not end. At least not until the rebels were destroyed. Meanwhile, mysterious hooded figures lurked behind the doors. One of the men ordered them not to kill him, but just to tie him up and make sure everyone understood. Once the men came to an agreement, one of them kicked the door with his foot. The blow was so hard that it threw back the Nirei man who was about to leave the office. Under one of the hoods was a Ukyu that pointed his spear at the men of Nirei and thought they were trying to kill a revolutionary. He pushed one of the men with his spear, who staggered from the impact. Ukyu smirked and suggested that they try to do it again, but only in about 100 years. The head told the boys that they had made a huge mistake and they shouldn't have gone against him. One of Nuri's men tried to stab him with a knife, but Ukyu dodged and grabbed his mirror in his hands. Ukyu raised the mirror above his head, which reflected one of the vases. It engulfed the vase and turned it into thousands of similar vases that rained down on the enemies. The entire room from top to bottom appeared to be covered with vases. Akaio couldn't believe that they really wanted to defeat him with an ambush, which he already faced all the time. After defeating the last enemy, the head ran further down the corridor. The spearhead had already realized that they had set traps for them and assumed that the kingdom was behind it. Knife Akaio also thought it was sneaky and doubted it was their main force. Mira replied that in that case it must be an anti-peace group. Elixir was he delighted that their head had apparently been inflamed after being attacked. Either way, it was to their advantage. Akaio laughed out loud and admitted that he had never felt so good even when they tried to kill him. Sure, it felt good, but Spear asked her master to hurry up and wipe all that blood off of her. She didn't consider herself any sort of mere tool for killing people. Knife decided to hurt her and said she was pretty dirty and it would be better if they threw her away. Still, they were tools so they shouldn't complain about how they were being used. Spear decided that they were all just saying it out of jealousy, and Akaio asked everyone to shut up. The hooded man that Ukyu met on the way used his wind blade. People shouted that he couldn't get away, but the guy used his mirror again and dropped piles of vases on them. As he ran away, Akaio noticed that this was the very real problem, for they had a mage among the people. As the guy ran down the corridor, he noticed that there was also an ambush waiting for him in front. The head stopped on the spot, realizing that he was surrounded on all sides. People in cloaks were shouting that it was over and jumped on the guy. But suddenly, one of the enemy's side abruptly fell to the ground. The attackers and Ukyu stared in surprise at the mysterious guest in armor. The man reincarnated into a beast had an Essay's sword in his hands. All 4 Ukyu treasures were thrilled to meet their comrade. One of the enemies ordered the rebel to be seized, and all the men pounced on the warrior. The beastman screamed and applied absolute light defense, which completely imprisoned the Ukyu in the walls. The attackers froze in place, thinking it was a protective magic wall, and didn't understand how this beastman could apply it. The beastman jumped onto the protective wall above the head of the head and, pushing off of it, went to attack the attackers. One of the enemy mages shouted that the warrior was open to strike, but his target disappeared, causing the enemy to miss. Before he knew it, the enemy was at his back. Everything happened exactly as he had imagined. With these thoughts, the beastman struck the attacker with his sword. After the battle was over, the protective wall around the Ukyu disappeared. Akaio frowned and decided that he was a trickster. The head asked the warrior whose side he was on, and the man put his sword to his back. The mysterious beast man reincarnated as a guy named Seiga and said he was from the kingdom of Arcana. That night, Sunsui, along with the rest of the boys, sat outside a small wooden house and looked up at the stars. At some point, Dewey decided to ask Sunsui something. Apparently they had guests, and it was an armed group that was heading straight for them. She hoped he didn't object to her orders and Sunsui listened to her unconditionally. Dewey smiled gloatingly and asked for every last one of the men to be beheaded. She would like to see their heads rolling around this field. Taking his blade in hand, the hero was ready to listen to any order from his mistress. At some point, Sunsui thought about how he would fulfill this order and what he would do.